Recorded Books and One-Click Digital present What Remains of Heaven by C.S. Harris, narrated by Davina Porter. Chapter 1. Tanfield Hill, Tuesday, 7th of July, 1812. His breath coming in undignified gasps, the Reverend Malcolm Earnshaw abandoned the village high street and struck out through the lanky grass of the churchyard. He was a small, plump man, well into his middle years, his hair sparse and greying, his knees stiff. Looking up, he saw the belfry of the village church silhouetted dark against the white of the evening sky, and suppressed a groan. "What have I done? What have I done?" he murmured to himself in a kind of chant. He never should have lingered so long with old Mrs. Cummings. Yes, the woman was dying, but he'd done what he could to ease her passing, and one did not keep the Bishop of London waiting, especially when one was a lowly churchman who owed the bishop's family his living. Hot and breathless now in his haste, the Reverend reached the sweep of gravel before the church. His step faltered, the small stones crunching beneath the leather soles of his shoes. "Merciful heavens," he whispered, his jaw sagging at the sight of the bishop's carriage, its coachman dozing on the box. "He's here." Swallowing hard, Earnshaw cast a searching glance around the ancient churchyard. Despite the lengthening shadows, the jagged piles of stones and aged timbers left from the demolition of the charnel house that had once stood against the north wall of the chancel were clearly visible. But Bishop Prescott was nowhere in sight. The Reverend hesitated, the urge to rush forward warring with a craven desire to duck into the sacristy for a lantern. He pushed on, his heart thumping painfully in his chest as he neared the gaping hole before him. The workmen had accidentally broken through the thin brick wall that afternoon. The wall had concealed a forgotten staircase of worn stone steps that led down to an ancient crypt, far older even than the venerable Norman nave above it. During his 10 years of service here at St. Margaret's, Malcolm Earnshaw had heard vague rumours of a crypt sealed decades ago for health reasons. But nothing the Reverend had heard had prepared him for the workman's gruesome discovery. Tugging his handkerchief from his pocket, he pressed the linen folds against his mouth and nostrils as the foul air of the crypt wafted up to him. He was near enough now to see the glow of lantern light on the worn steps coming up from below. The bishop had indeed gone before him. Again Earnshaw hesitated, not from indecision this time, but from revulsion at the horror of what lay below. The Bible taught that the trumpet shall sound, and the dead shall be raised incorruptible. And again, in Ezekiel, it was written that God shall put flesh on the bones of the dead, and breathe life into them. Earnshaw knew that. Yet still he found himself trembling at the need to confront once again a sight that might have been conjured from the vilest visions of Dante's Inferno. Grasping the rusted railing that ran along one side of the steps, he stumbled down the shadowy stairs toward the flickering light below. "I most humbly beg your pardon, Bishop Prescott," he began, his voice echoing back to him from that sepulchral vault. "I do hope I've not kept you waiting long." The oppressive silence of the crypt closed around him. Built of rough stone covered in limestone mortar, and with a low vaulted ceiling supported by worn columns, the bays of the chamber stretched before him in shadowy phalanxes of death. Piles of coffins, stacked 5 and 6 high, were crammed into nearly every bay, their wood warped and split to reveal tomb-blackened remnants of tattered clothing and the occasional, unmistakable gleam of a skull or long bone. But that clean scouring of time was rare. What truly horrified the Reverend and caused him to tighten his grip on the stair railing was the way the dry air had combined with the high concentration of lime to preserve most of the burials. All too often, what spilled from those crushed tombs was an arm or leg still recognizably human, or a hair-topped nightmare of a face, its flesh shriveled and tanned like that of a mummy brought back from Egypt. "Bishop Prescott," Earnshaw called again, his voice quavering. Misled by the gleam of lamplight, he'd obviously erred in choosing to come here directly. The bishop must simply have abandoned his lantern in the crypt and returned to the sacristy to wait. Devastated by his error, Earnshaw was turning back toward the stairs when his gaze fell on the far end of the chamber. A man lay face down beside the last worn, spiraled column. Only this was not some ancient, desiccated corpse tumbled from its collapsed coffin. "Bishop Prescott," said Earnshaw with a gasp, recognizing the man's tall, gaunt form, the distinctive purple cassock, the thinning white hair worn unusually long. The Reverend staggered to where the bishop lay, with his head turned slightly to one side, his pale grey eyes open wide and blankly staring. From beneath the matted, crushed side of his head, a spreading stain of blood ran in a slow, dark rivulet across the ancient stone floor. Chapter 2. London, the early hours of Wednesday, 8th of July, 1812. The circular room at Carlton House was an inner sanctum reserved for the most intimate friends of His Royal Highness George, Prince Regent. Here, amidst the glitter of crystal chandeliers and the glories of blue silk draped in imitation of a Roman tent, those with the privilege of entree gathered late into the night to drink wine and listen to music and bask in all the benefits of being in the royal favour. But tonight the prince was in a petulant mood, his full, almost feminine lower lip thrust out into a pout. "I hear the Bishop of London is set to give a speech against slavery before the Lords this Thursday," said the regent, snapping his fingers for another bottle. Once the prince had been a handsome man. Now, in his early 50s, a lifetime of overindulgence in the various delights of the flesh had taken their toll. His face was flushed, his features blurred, and not even the talents of London's best tailors, or the use of rigidly laced stays, could disguise the corpulence of his body. His stays creaking perilously, the regent turned to frown at his cousin, Charles, Lord Jarvis, the acknowledged power behind the prince's frail regency. "What say you, Jarvis? Surely there's some way to stop him?" His cousin Jarvis was also a big man, standing more than 6 feet tall and fleshy. Jarvis's size alone would have made him impressive, but it was his awe-inspiring intellect, his formidable ruthlessness, and a true dedication to king and country that had combined to make him the most powerful man in the kingdom. He took a slow sip of his own wine before answering, "I hardly see what, short of killing him." A nervous titter spread amongst the men gathered near enough to hear. Everyone knew that those Jarvis considered his enemies, or even merely inconvenient, had a nasty habit of turning up dead. The prince's pout grew. One of his intimates, a slim, hawk-faced exquisite named Lord Quillian, raised one eyebrow and said, "The man's on a bloody crusade. You're not troubled by it, Jarvis?" Jarvis flicked open a gold snuff-box with one careless finger. "You think I should be?" "Considering the fact that Prescott was largely responsible for getting the Slave Trade Act passed 5 years ago, I'd say so, yes. There's a growing piety in this country, combined with a mawkish kind of sensibility that worries me. It's easy to support abolition in theory." Jarvis raised a pinch of snuff to his nostril. "In practice, things become considerably more complicated." A movement near the door drew Jarvis's attention. A tall military-looking gentleman in a riding coat and top boots spoke in a low voice to the attendants, then strode across the room to whisper in Jarvis's ear. "Excuse me, Your Highness," said the king's powerful cousin with a bow. "I shan't be but a moment." Withdrawing to a secluded alcove, Jarvis snapped, "What is it?" The tall military-looking gentleman, a former captain in the 9th Foot, smiled. "The Bishop of London is dead." In the cool light of early morning, father and son trotted their horses companionably side by side through Hyde Park. Faint wisps of mist still hovered here and there beneath the trees, although the strengthening sun was beginning to burn off the fog rising from the nearby river.
"It's been 2 months now since Percival was shot,"
grumbled Alistair James Sincere, 5th Earl of Hendon. Mounted on a big grey gelding, the Earl was a powerfully framed man of 66, with a barrel chest, a thick shock of white hair, and vivid blue eyes.
2 months,
he said again, when his son made no comment.
"And Liverpool is still acting more like an incompetent backbencher than a Prime Minister. This situation can't continue. We're already at war with half of Europe. The next thing you know, we're going to have the bloody Americans attacking Canada."
Mounted on the neat black Arab mare he'd acquired during his years as an army officer, the Earl's only surviving son and heir, Sebastian, Viscount Devlin, ducked his head to hide a smile. Even taller than his father, the Viscount was built lean, with dark hair, and strange, feral-looking yellow eyes.
"You're the one who turned down the Regent's invitation to form a government," he said. "I should rather think so,"
said the Earl, who for the past 3 years had held the position of Chancellor of the Exchequer.
"Why should I spend my days fighting Jarvis for the loyalty of my own cabinet? Once I might have been persuaded to do so. No longer."
"I should think you'd jump at the chance," said Sebastian, "if for no other reason than to spite Jarvis." The king's formidable, yearly, omnipotent cousin intimidated most men, but not Hendon. The two had been at loggerheads for as long as Sebastian could remember. Yet, as powerful as he was, Jarvis would never form a government himself. The big man preferred to exercise his authority discreetly, and more effectively, from the shadows. Hendon blew out a long breath.
"I must be getting old. I find I've better things to do with my time."
Sebastian raised one eyebrow.
"You heard me,"
said Hendon.
"I'd like to spend my declining years surrounded by a passel of lusty grandsons. Unfortunately, my only surviving son has yet to condescend to give me any."
"You have a grandson and a granddaughter."
"Bayard?"
Hendon dismissed the children of his only legitimate daughter, Amanda, Lady Wilcox, with a wave of one hand.
"Bayard's a Wilcox, and half as mad as his father besides. I'm talking about sincere grandsons, the kind only you can give me. Heirs. You're nearly 30 years old now, Sebastian. It's high time you settled down and started a family."
Sebastian kept his gaze firmly fixed between his horse's ears and said nothing. The estrangement that had arisen between father and son the previous autumn had eased these past few weeks, but Hendon was straying into dangerous territory. There was a moment of tense silence. Then the Earl grunted, his eyes narrowing as he stared across the park.
"I see you're still employing that impertinent pickpocket as a groom."
Sebastian followed his father's gaze to where a sharp-faced boy, dressed in the Devlin livery and mounted on one of Sebastian's hacks, pelted inelegantly toward them, one elbow cocked skyward to hold his hat in place.
"What the devil?"
Tom, Sebastian's young tiger, reined in hard beside them. He was 13 years old, although he looked younger, with his gap-toothed grin and slight frame. Bobbing his head to Hendon, he said breathlessly,
"Begging your pardon for the interruption, your lordship."
He turned to Sebastian.
"Your visitors awaiting you at Brook Street, Governor. Your aunt, the Duchess of Claiborne, and the Archbishop of Canterbury."
Devlin said,
"The Archbishop of Canterbury? Henrietta?"
said his father, eyes widening with incredulity.
"At this hour?"
The Duchess of Claiborne was famous for never leaving her bed before noon. Hendon sniffed the air.
"The boy is obviously foxed."
"I ain't been drinking," said Tom, bridling. "It's Her Grace all right, sitting up there in the drawing-room with the Archbishop himself."
Hendon's suspicious frown deepened.
"The last I heard, Archbishop Moore was essentially at death's door. Why, Jarvis is already manoeuvring to line up the man's replacement."
"Well, he don't look none too hale, that's for sure,"
agreed Tom.
"But I reckon that's to be expected, given what's happened."
"What has happened?" said Sebastian.
"Why, someone's done gone and murdered the Bishop of London. Last night in the crypt of some church near Hounslow Heath."
Chapter 3. In addition to a modest estate in Hampshire, bequeathed him by a maiden great-aunt, Sebastian also kept an elegant little bow-fronted townhouse in Brook Street. His long-suffering majordomo, Maury, met him at the door with a grave bow.
"The Archbishop of Canterbury and the Duchess of Claiborne are here to see you, my lord, in the drawing-room." "Good God!"
Sebastian handed the majordomo his riding crop, hat, and gloves.
"It's true, then?"
Maury bowed again.
"Yes, my lord. I took the liberty of offering to send up tea, but her ladyship refused."
Sebastian climbed the stairs to the first floor 2 at a time to find his Aunt Henrietta, a vision in purple silk and a towering turban, ensconced in one of the delicate chairs beside the drawing-room's bowed front window. A grey-haired, skeletally thin cleric with the pallid complexion of a man in the final stages of consumption sat opposite her. They were great old friends, his aunt and the Archbishop of Canterbury. Sebastian knew the Archbishop's long illness and approaching death had caused her considerable distress.
"My apologies for coming to you in all my dirt," said Sebastian, "but I understand the reason for your visit is urgent."
Archbishop John Moore held out a thin, blue-veined hand that trembled visibly.
"And I am sorry if we forced you to curtail your morning ride. You'll excuse me if I do not stand."
Sebastian bowed low over the Archbishop's frail hand, then turned to kiss his aunt's cheek.
"Shall I ring for tea?"
"I've had all the tea I want this morning," said Aunt Henrietta with an inelegant grunt. "What I need is brandy." 5 years Hendon senior, the Dowager Duchess of Claiborne was one of the grand old dames of society. As solidly built as her brother, she had Hendon's broad, fleshy face and the fiercely blue, sincere eyes. But she was looking decidedly drawn this morning, and it occurred to Sebastian that she was abroad so early because she'd yet to make it to her bed. "You do have brandy, don't you?" she said sharply when he hesitated. Sebastian cast an inquiring eye toward Archbishop Moore.
"Brandy sounds like a marvellous idea," said the Archbishop with a shaky smile.
Sebastian moved to the decanter kept on a side table near the hearth.
"Brandy it is."
"I assume by now you've heard of the death of the Bishop of London," said Henrietta.
"Only moments ago."
The Archbishop cleared his throat.
"It appears someone bashed in his skull last night in the crypt of St. Margaret's in Tanfield Hill."
Sebastian splashed brandy into 3 glasses and wondered what any of this had to do with him.
"The crypt has been shut up for decades,"
said the Archbishop as Sebastian handed him a glass.
"I gather the odours from the place had begun to interfere with the use of the church and raised concerns about disease. The decision was made to wall it off."
Personally, Sebastian had always found the practice of stacking coffins in open crypts bizarre to the point of being barbaric, but he kept that observation to himself. He handed his aunt her brandy and said,
"If the crypt was shut up, then what was the bishop doing down there?"
"Some workman accidentally broke through the bricked-up entrance yesterday and made an unpleasant discovery," said the Archbishop. "Due to the potential for scandal, the Reverend thought it best to involve Bishop Prescott right away."
Sebastian went to lean against the mantelpiece. "Scandal? Why?"
"Because of the body."
Sebastian paused with his glass raised halfway to his lips.
"The body?"
"The dead body in the crypt," said his aunt, as if he were being deliberately obtuse. Sebastian took a sip of his brandy and shuddered. He had something of a reputation for hard drinking and wild living, But 7:30 in the morning was a little early to be drinking brandy, even for Sebastian. I should imagine there are any number of dead bodies in the crypt of St. Margaret's. It dates from, what, the 12th century?
Actually, the crypt is even older than the church, said the Archbishop. It dates back to Anglo-Saxon times.
So hundreds of bodies, said Sebastian, if not 1,000 or more.
Henrietta leaned forward, her brandy held delicately aloft in one hand.
The body the workmen discovered was not one of the burials, Sebastian. The man was obviously murdered down there. She lowered her voice. At some point before the crypt was sealed. He was found sprawled on the floor behind one of the columns, with a knife in his back.
Sebastian glanced from his aunt to the Archbishop beside her.
Excuse me, Your Grace, but why are you here, telling me this?
You know perfectly well why we're here, Sebastian, snapped his aunt. We are here because the Archbishop wants you to solve the murders.
Why?
Why? She echoed indignantly. What do you mean, why? Because you're good at it, of course.
Sebastian stood perfectly still. He'd been afraid this was coming.
I can understand that the local magistrate might find the matter overwhelming, but I should think Bow Street more than capable of dealing with the case.
The Archbishop cleared his throat again.
I have already discussed the situation with Bow Street. Sir Henry Lovejoy concurs with my decision to bring you into the investigation. Bow Street is all well and good when it comes to dealing with the murder of a shopkeeper or merchant, but they simply don't have the capability of handling an incident at this level of society, and they know it.
Pushing away from the hearth, Sebastian went to stand beside the window overlooking the street below. It was true that in the last year and a half he'd found himself drawn into a number of murder investigations. Yet those murders had touched him personally in some way, or had involved victims who were otherwise unlikely to find justice, and each case had peeled another layer off his soul. He said,
"The last time I participated in a murder investigation, something like 12 people ended up dead."
I can understand your reluctance to be drawn into this, said the Archbishop in his soothing father-confessor voice.
Did he? Sebastian wondered. Did he have any idea of the passions that swirled around murder?
The secrets and lies, the rage and despair.
The Archbishop's watery grey eyes narrowed. The man might be old and ill, but no one rose to become the most powerful churchman in all of England without being both intelligent and very, very astute.
Yet, I wonder if you understand how critical it is to the well-being of the nation that this murder be solved, and solved quickly.
When Sebastian kept silent, Moore continued,
It's no secret that my days are numbered. The process is already underway to select my successor, which is as it should be. A lengthy hiatus in these situations is best avoided. As it happens, Bishop Prescott was a strong contender for the position. In fact, he was my personal favorite.
Sebastian frowned.
You think that might have something to do with his death?
It might. At this point, we've no way of knowing.
Setting aside his brandy, the Archbishop leaned forward, his hands coming together as if in prayer.
But consider this. It's been just 2 months since the Prime Minister was killed. Now the Bishop of London has been murdered. If I die tomorrow...
He paused to spread his hands wide, as if inviting Sebastian to imagine a nation bereft of both spiritual and political leadership.
This is a dangerous time in our nation's history,
he continued solemnly, his hands coming together again when Sebastian still remained silent.
We've been at war virtually without pause for 2 decades. There is widespread suffering and much discontent among the people. And now the Americans are threatening to attack us.
Sebastian huffed a soft laugh. I see. It's both my spiritual and my patriotic duty to solve this murder, is it? His aunt frowned at him. Ignoring her, Sebastian said, The other body, the one with the knife in his back. Who was he? The sudden direct question seemed to take the Archbishop by surprise. That we do not know. But you say he was killed years ago. So it would appear, yes. From his clothing, I'm told it's likely he died sometime in the last century. The puzzle was undeniably intriguing. 2 men murdered in a crypt, their violent deaths separated by decades. Sebastian stared out the window at a baker's boy making his rounds with the strap of a tray slung around his neck. "Hot buns," he called. "Fresh hot buns." Aunt Henrietta could keep silent no longer. "Well," she demanded, "will you do it?" Sebastian turned to meet his aunt's anxious stare. If the Archbishop had come alone to request Sebastian's assistance, Sebastian would have turned him down without hesitation. Exaggerated appeals to his patriotism inevitably fell flat, while the true nature of Sebastian's spiritual beliefs would doubtless give the old cleric a severe shock. Yet the wily old Archbishop was obviously shrewd enough to guess some of it, which was why he had brought his dear old friend, the Duchess of Claiborne, here with him. She might be gruff and ruthlessly unsentimental, but of all the members of Sebastian's family, she was the only one who had never let him down, whose love he'd always known was pure and unconditional. Sebastian could not refuse her. He raised his brandy to his lips and drained the glass. "I'll do it." Chapter 4. The village of Tanfield Hill lay about half a mile to the south of the main post road between London and the West Country, just beyond the notorious highwayman-infested stretch of open land known as Hounslow Heath. Here, the scrub and gorse of the heath began to give way to open, rolling woodland of oak and silver birch. The village itself was a picturesque collection of thatched cottages and whitewashed stone shops strung out along a cobbled high street and a few flanking lanes. Driving himself in his curricle, Sebastian rattled over a narrow stone bridge spanning the quiet millstream and into the village at around 10:30 that morning. The sun was up, strong now, bathing the old stone walls in a warm, bucolic glow and filling the air with the sweet scent of roses and honeysuckle tumbling over garden fences and scrambling up neat lattices. From here, he could see the low, solid nave and single spire of the ancient Norman church of St. Margaret's, crowning a gentle hill covered with daisy-strewn grass and a scattering of aged, moss-covered tombstones. He turned his chestnuts up the slope toward the gravel sweep before the church, where Sir Henry Lovejoy stood talking to a workman dressed in a rough smock. A diminutive middle-aged man with a bald head and a serious demeanour, Sir Henry was the newest of Bow Street's 3 stipendiary magistrates. At the sight of Sebastian, he dismissed the workman with a nod and started across the gravel toward the curricle. "Find some place to water and rest them," Sebastian told his tiger, handing the young groom the chestnut's reins. "We'll be here a while." "I'll take care of 'em, Governor," said Tom, scrambling from his perch at the rear of the carriage. "Ne'er you fear." "Oh, and Tom, ask around a bit while you're at it. I'd like to hear what the locals are saying about all this." "Aye, Governor." "Lord Evelyn," called Sir Henry, coming up to him. "So the Archbishop convinced you to take an interest in the investigation after all, did he? I feared he might not succeed. This isn't exactly your normal type of murder." Sebastian hopped down from the curricle's high seat. "I didn't know I had a normal type of murder." Once this earnest little magistrate had sought Sebastian's own arrest, but over the past year and a half, the sternly religious magistrate and the urbane, irreverent Viscount had built an odd friendship, founded on mutual respect and a strong abiding sense of trust. Sebastian said,
Bow Street didn't object to the suggestion that I become involved.
One corner of the magistrate's thin lips twitched with the faintest suggestion of a smile.
I wouldn't exactly describe Sir James's reaction as pleased, but when the Archbishop of Canterbury personally intervenes in an investigation, not even the Chief Magistrate would dare complain.
And you?
Me?
Turning, Lovejoy led the way to the northern side of the ancient parish church, where scattered piles of building rubble lay deserted beneath the strengthening sun.
When it comes to murder in the upper reaches of society and government, I know our limits. A delicate business, this, and puzzling. Most puzzling.
Sebastian's head tipped back, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the worn, age-darkened stone walls of the church. The nave of St. Margaret's had the narrow, round-topped windows and heavy masonry typical of the early Norman period. Only the tower was noticeably lighter and more delicate, its spire probably added in early Tudor times. He let his gaze fall to the rubble at their feet. Through the remnants of a broken wall, he could see the upper reaches of a set of worn stone steps that disappeared down into a well of black.
How long ago was the crypt bricked up?
He asked, peering into the darkness. His voice echoed back at him from below.
As near as anyone can remember, it was around the time of the revolt in America.
The magistrate had an unnaturally high-pitched voice that had a tendency to squeak when he became excited or nervous. He was squeaking now.
So, 30 or 40 years ago?
Something like that, yes.
A lantern rested on a large flat-topped stone near the broken wall. Stooping, Lovejoy flipped open the door and began to kindle his tinderbox.
According to the workmen, an old charnel house stood here. They were in the process of demolishing it when they stumbled upon the entrance to the crypt. It's been closed off for so long that people had forgotten the stairs were here. I gather it was a bit of a shock when the workmen broke through the wall, and even more of a shock when a couple of the lads decided to go exploring and tripped over the body of a man dressed in the velvets and lace of the last century and with a knife sticking out his back. According to the workman, the Reverend took one look at the body and left almost immediately for London.
Sebastian stared off down the hill to where the mill stream curled lazily around a stand of willows.
It seems a curious thing to have done. Why go to the bishop? Why not the local magistrate?
Lovejoy frowned over his task.
From what I understand, Reverend Earnshaw is of a somewhat, shall we say, excitable disposition.
Sebastian raised one eyebrow in surprise.
You haven't actually spoken to him?
The magistrate was still struggling with his tinderbox.
Not yet, unfortunately. The discovery of the bishop's body on top of the other horrors of the crypt seems to have been too much for the man. He managed to stagger over to the manor and tell his tale to Douglas Pyle. That's the local magistrate, by the way. A typical village squire, far more interested in horses and hounds than in solving murders. Anyway, as soon as the Reverend told Pyle where to find the bodies, he simply went home and dosed himself with laudanum. Liberally.
The magistrate's flame went out and he had to try again.
He's still insensible.
Sebastian resisted the urge to take the tinderbox from Lovejoy's hands and light it for him. The magistrate was uncharacteristically shaken.
You say Earnshaw found the bishop?
That's right.
But if the Reverend himself went to London to get Prescott, then what was the bishop doing down in the crypt alone?
Lovejoy grunted with satisfaction as the lantern's wick finally caught.
According to what we've been able to ascertain, Reverend Earnshaw returned immediately to Tanfield Hill in his own gig, while the bishop followed later in his coach.
So where was the bishop's coachman while the bishop was getting his head bashed in?
He remained on his box as per the bishop's instructions. The man says he neither saw nor heard anything out of the ordinary.
Lovejoy tucked away his tinderbox and flipped the lantern's small door closed.
Although, if you ask me, he probably dozed off and awakened only when the Reverend set up a shout. Seems the Reverend spotted the bishop's light in the crypt and ventured down there again, alone,
only to discover the bishop lying nearly atop the earlier victim's body. Body? But surely if the other man had been dead for decades, he'd been reduced to a skeleton by now. A shadow of revulsion crossed the magistrate's pinched features. Unfortunately, no. I understand it has something to do with the composition of the soil and perhaps the lime in the mortar. If there's no intrusion of water, the corpses in a crypt can essentially mummify rather than decay. Sebastian became aware of the putrefying stench of death wafting up from below. I remember seeing something similar in Italy, in Palermo. Then you'll know what to expect, said the magistrate, turning toward the entrance to the crypt. Tightening his grip on the lantern's short handle, he stooped through the thin, broken remnants of the brick wall and started down the stairs. After a moment's hesitation, Sebastian followed. Worn and cracked by time, the steps descended through a narrow stone stair vault, the light from the lantern playing over an arched roof plastered with limestone. The air was cold and dank, with an unpleasant, almost greasy quality that seemed to wrap itself around them as they reached the base of the steps. They found themselves in an ancient central aisle, its low vaulted ceiling supported by thick spiral columns topped with crude pillow capitals. Dating back to Anglo-Saxon times, the crypt was larger than Sebastian had expected, with rows of bays opening to either side. Yet the bays seemed oddly dark. As his eyes quickly grew accustomed to the gloom, Sebastian realized the bays were dark because they were full of coffins. Hundreds and hundreds of wooden coffins, some left bare, some painted, but most upholstered in mouldering woolen cloth or draped in tattered velvet. Stacked row upon row, floor to ceiling, and curtained with massive sheets of cobwebs, they reached as far as he could see in all directions. "Good God," he whispered. "The bishop was found near the back end," said Lovejoy, his voice quavering as they walked between the towering walls of coffins. In the older sections of the crypt, the coffins at the bottom had begun to warp and split, their contents spilling out as the weight of the burials above slowly crushed the ancient wood below. Sebastian could see some bare bones, stained an odd brown, but most of the visible bodies were horribly whole, their skin shriveled and discoloured, but intact, their winding sheets and shrouds glowing white from the murky depths of the vaults. "Here," said Lovejoy, his hand trembling as he paused to hold the lantern aloft. "Bishop Prescott was found here, just beside this last column. I've already sent the bodies to be autopsied, but everything else is exactly as it was." Sebastian stared down at the long, rusty red stain of blood that had soaked into the uneven limestone paving blocks. "Where did you send them?" "To Gibson." Sebastian nodded with satisfaction. An army doctor who'd lost the lower part of one leg to a French cannonball, Paul Gibson now kept a small surgery near Tower Hill. No one in London knew more about death and the human body than Paul Gibson. "I'll go see him as soon as I get back to London." "Fortunately, the local magistrate had enough sense not to disturb anything," said Lovejoy. "I gather he took one look, posted guards at the entrance to the stairs, and sent for Bow Street." Sebastian hunkered down to study the stained stones. There must have been a lot of blood. But then, there would have been if the bishop had been hit on the head. In Sebastian's experience, head wounds bled prodigiously. Looking up, he studied the worn stone base of the nearby column. Any chance he might simply have fainted and bashed in his own skull? Lovejoy shook his head. "We found an iron bar, possibly one of the tools left by the workman, lying beside the body and covered in gore. I've sent it to Gibson along with the body so he could make comparisons, but I've no doubt he'll agree it was the murder weapon." Sebastian's gaze shifted to where the nearby paving stones showed a large, man-sized area of brown discoloration. "The other body was there?" Lovejoy made an odd strangled sound. "That's right." He must have been lying here in the shadows when the crypt was bricked up. They probably didn't even see him. The only reason Earnshaw spotted the bishop was because Prescott had brought a lantern with him. It was still sitting on the floor beside him, lit. Sebastian glanced over at the piles of cobweb-draped coffins stuffed into the nearest bay. The wood of one of the caskets had split, giving a grisly view of its desiccated contents. The corpse's head thrown back, its mouth wide open as if in an endless, soundless scream. But the weight of the burials above kept the cadaver pinned down. Sebastian had thought at first, seeing the way some of the coffins had shifted and smashed, that the velvet-dressed body might simply have fallen out of one of the collapsed vaults and rolled here. Now he realized that was unlikely. Apart from which, who would bury a murder victim with the knife still in its back? Sebastian pushed to his feet. Any idea who the other man might have been? None whatsoever. I'll be surprised if we ever know. Sebastian studied the surrounding bays, each with its own towering, mouldering cargo of splintered caskets and spilling contents. His eyes had completely adjusted to the gloom by now. There were times when he wished he were as blind in the dark as other men. Could there be another way in here? Lovejoy nodded toward the far end of the crypt. There's a second flight of steps that once led up to the apse and was originally closed off with just an iron gate. Both entrances were walled off at the same time. No one's been down here for decades. The magistrate shivered, and by mutual consent, the two men turned toward the stairwell. Sir James thinks the bishop must have surprised a thief, said Lovejoy. Someone who'd heard the crypt was open and seized the opportunity to sneak down here and look for jewellery or other valuables to steal from the dead. I suppose that's one explanation. Something in his tone caused Lovejoy to pause at the base of the steps and turn to stare back at him. Surely you don't think there's some connection between the two murders? How could there be, with decades between them? Sebastian had no explanation, of course, although he found it difficult to believe that two men could be murdered in almost exactly the same spot without there being some connection between them, even if their murders did take place decades apart. It does seem unlikely, he agreed. Lovejoy started up the steps, the crypt plunging into darkness again as the lantern light quivered over the old whitewashed stones of the stair vault. Alternatively, someone could have been following the bishop, intending to do him harm. He seized the opportunity offered by the bishop's descent alone into the crypt and killed him. You're aware that Prescott was a serious contender to be named the next Archbishop of Canterbury, said Sebastian, following him. Reaching the top of the stairs, the magistrate scrambled through the broken wall. The Archbishop did mention it, yes, although I received the impression that he was inclined to agree with Sir James's assessment, that the bishop simply fell victim to a chance-met thief. Sebastian followed him out of the rank chill of the stairwell into the clean, wholesome warmth of the sunny June day. I suspect the Archbishop was being diplomatic. Lovejoy snuffed out his lantern. What makes you say that? Sebastian stared off down the hill toward the rambling slate-roofed vicarage, where a middle-aged matron in a starched white cap and a high-necked black bombazine gown was standing on the back stoop, watching them. Because if the Archbishop genuinely believes the Bishop of London was killed by a simple thief, then why did he come to me? Chapter 5. While Lovejoy set about organising a party of constables to conduct a more thorough search of the crypt, Sebastian walked down the hill to the vicarage to inquire after the Reverend Malcolm Earnshaw. He's still abed, said the matron in black bombazine, who proved to be the Reverend's wife. She was a hatchet-faced woman, her features as plain as her gown, and just as no-nonsense. He's received a terrible shock, simply terrible. I've had Dr. Bliss in to see him, and he agrees it's best to keep the Reverend quiet for a time, lest the incident overset his mind.
She gave Sebastian a fierce, uncompromising scowl and refused to budge. The Reverend's wife was obviously made of sterner stuff than the Reverend. Sebastian had no choice but to admit defeat and withdraw. His next stop was the small but graceful 18th-century brick manor house that stood at the edge of the village near the mill stream. He found the local magistrate, Douglas Pyle, behind the house, in his kennel. He was a typical Middlesex squire, booted and spurred, full of jowl and wide of girth, with the ruddy, weathered face and squinting grey eyes of a man who spent his days tending his herds and fields and riding to hounds.
"You've no objection to talking to me while I supervise the feeding of the hounds?"
said the squire, his voice deep and rough. Sebastian took him to be somewhere in his early 50s, his brown hair mingled liberally with grey.
"Not at all,"
said Sebastian, stooping to tug the ears of a liver-coloured bitch that loped up to sniff at him.
"She smells the crypt on you,"
said the squire, watching the dog.
"My wife swears she'll never get the reek of it out of the clothes I had on last night."
"It's a fine pack of hounds you've got here."
"They're Irish,"
said the squire, nodding to the kennel boy.
"And rogues, the lot of 'em. They'll bring down a cow if you turn your back on 'em, but they can't be beat on a hunt."
The two men watched as the kennel boy dumped boiled meat into the trough, the hounds jostling and scrabbling for position.
"I suppose you're here to talk about the murder,"
said the squire, not looking around.
"Murders,"
said Sebastian.
"There were 2 bodies, after all." "Oh, aye, 2.
The squire grunted.
"Which is 2 more than I've ever had to deal with. Believe me, I'm more than happy to turn the old nasty business over to Bow Street. What do I know of murder?"
Sebastian studied the squire's pack as they gulped eagerly at the trough. They were smaller than most foxhounds, but strongly built with broad heads. "I understand the Reverend Earnshaw came to see you when he found the bishop's body. What time was that?"
"About 8, I suppose. Maybe 1:30. At first I thought the poor man had gone stark raving mad, babbling on the way he was about crypts and dead bishops and pools of blood. It took a bit of convincing before I finally agreed to go over to the church and have a look at the place. But there was the bishop all right, dead as dead comes."
"You saw the older body as well, did you?"
"The fright in blue velvet and lace?"
The squire's ruddy cheeks sagged, and he pursed his lips to blow out a long breath.
"I'll be seeing that face in my dreams for the rest of my life. Or rather, in my nightmares. He looked like a hog left too long in the smokehouse."
"You didn't recognize him?" The squire gave a laugh that jostled his belly up and down.
"Never knew anyone looked like a dried hog. Did you?"
Sebastian smiled. "Point taken. Can you think of anyone in these parts who disappeared somewhere around the time of the revolt in the American colonies?"
"Not off the top of my head.
But then I wasn't here myself for much of that time." He squared his shoulders with obvious pride.
"The 16th Light Dragoons. Cornet. We spent 2 years in the colonies fighting to put down the rebellion. We could have managed it too if the bloody government had been willing to let us do what was necessary. Now look where we find ourselves, dealing with a bunch of upstarts calling themselves the United States of America and threatening to declare war on us."
"So you were in the 16th, were you?" said Sebastian, encouraging him. "Where else did you see service?"
"India, and then Cape Town. We were headed for the West Indies when my father wrote to say my brother Ted had died, and I was to set out and come home."
The trough was almost empty now. Sir Douglas watched as the greedier hounds shifted from place to place, intent on scooping up the last morsels.
"What makes you so sure it was someone from around here, anyway?" he asked. "We're but an hour's ride from London, after all. It could even have been someone who wandered over from West Wickham. 30 or 40 years ago, that would have been back in the days of Sir Francis Dashwood and his Hellfire Club. I remember once when I was a lad, the priest caught Dashwood himself breaking into the crypt, looking to steal skulls and such for their blasphemous orgies."
What about last night? Sebastian asked. Any strangers around? The squire shook his head.
I did ask, you know, before that squeaky-voiced magistrate showed up from Bow Street and took over. No one noticed anything out of the ordinary. The Reverend did think he saw the shadow of a man in the churchyard as he was leaving the crypt. But the truth is, Mr. Earnshaw's as blind as a bat, and the bishop's own coachman was sitting right there on the box of his carriage just a few feet from the church door the old time, and he never saw a thing.
The trough was empty now, the hounds whining to be let out of the feeding yard.
If he'd been a different sort of man, I'd say Prescott probably just fainted and bashed his head on the edge of a coffin or some such thing. The piles have always been buried in the churchyard, thank God, but not the Prescotts. Can't be pleasant seeing your own kith and kin reduced to grinning horrors. Not that it ever seemed to bother the Prescott brothers.
Are you saying the bishop was from around here?
Didn't you know? He grew up at Prescott Grange, between here and Hounslow. The Prescott brothers used to play in that crypt all the time when they were boys. All 5 of them.
5?
Aye, 5 of them, God rest their souls.
Some cousin or other had the living back then, and they used to steal the key to the gates off his belt when he was dozing in the sacristy. Turning to the kennel boy, Pyle said,
Open the door and let them have a run.
The kennel boy opened the door and called,
Come, hounds!
Sebastian stepped back, his gaze on the squire's full, weathered face.
You went down there with them, did you?
A self-conscious grin crinkled the fleshy corners of the squire's pale eyes.
Well, of course I did. Even played deerstalker and blindman's wand down there with them.
Sir Douglas watched the hounds sweep through the open door, his smile fading as they raced off in joyous, fluid leaps.
But I never liked it, he said.
Then he said it again, as if once weren't enough.
I never liked it.
Learn anything? Sebastian asked Tom when the tiger brought up the curricle.
Nobody in the village seen or heard a thing last night,
said Tom, scrambling onto his perch as Sebastian gave the horses the office to start.
Not till the Reverend started screeching, at any rate.
Sebastian nodded.
I gather the combination of a murdered bishop and legions of old, half-decayed corpses was too much for the man's delicate senses.
What?
He said, breaking off when Tom leaned forward to give an audible sniff.
What is it?
Tom's nose wrinkled.
What's that smell?
The crypt. I'm told the odour is rather pervasive.
What?
Pervasive. It sinks in and doesn't go away.
I don't know about that, but there's no denying it stinks.
He cast a wistful gaze over his shoulder as they started on the road back to London.
I'd like to have seen it.
Would you indeed? Frankly, I think it's the best argument in favour of cremation I've ever encountered.
What?
Cremation. It's a method of body disposal practiced by the Hindus in India. The deceased is placed on a pile of wood and burnt.
Burnt? Well, that's horrible. Why, it's unchristian, it is.
Sebastian laughed.
You think that's horrible? You should see what 30 or 40 years in a crypt will do to you.
As they reached the outskirts of the village, he dropped his hands and let the chestnuts spring forward.
I tell you what, when we get to Paul Gibson's surgery, you can have a look at the mummified body they brought out of that crypt. Make up your own mind.
Tom stared at him.
I can?
You can.
Cool,
said Tom, and gave a little shiver of anticipatory delight. But by the time they reached the narrow, winding lanes and ancient stone shops of Tower Hill, the sun was high in the sky, and the coats of the horses gleamed dark with sweat.
If you're going to be here long, I reckon I shall take the chestnuts back to Brook Street,
said Tom, unable to keep the disappointment out of his voice. Sebastian hopped down to the lane's worn footpath.
Yes, take them home. They've had a good run. See them put up, and then bring the curricle back with the greys.
Tom's face cleared.
"And then I can see the mummy?"
"And then you can see the mummy."
"Thank you, my lord."
Sebastian stood for a moment, watching the former street urchin negotiate his way through the lane's traffic with admirable skill. Then Sebastian turned to cut through the noisome alley that ran along one side of the surgery to a neglected rear garden and the low stone building where Paul Gibson performed his autopsies. It was also here where the surgeon expanded his understanding of the human body with surreptitious dissections performed on a covert supply of cadavers, culled from the city's churchyards and sold by masked, dangerous men who did their best work on dark and moonless nights. Chapter 6. Charles, Lord Jarvis, was in the library of his house on Berkeley Square, perusing the latest report from one of his French agents, when his daughter Hero came to stand in the doorway and said without preamble, "Did you kill the Bishop of London?" He looked up at her. Since the death of his son, David, at sea several years before, she was his only surviving child. In some ways she was a handsome woman, with a Juno-esque build and strong features. But she looked too much like Jarvis himself, and had far too forceful a personality to ever be considered pretty. He said,
"I won't deny I'm glad Prescott's dead, but it's not my work."
She met his gaze and held it. "Would you lie to me?"
"I might, but not in this instance."
At that, she gave a soft laugh. "I must say, I am glad to hear it." Jarvis settled back in his chair.
"The bishop was something of a favourite of yours, was he not?"
"We were friends, yes. We worked on several projects together." Jarvis made a face.
"Projects? You're 25, Hero. Isn't it time you gave up this unnatural penchant for good works and found yourself a husband?"
"I might." She came to lean over the back of his chair. "If English law didn't grant a man the powers of a despot over his wife."
"A despot, Hero?"
"A despot." She placed an affectionate hand on his shoulder. "But as for good works, you must be thinking of Mamma. She's always been far better at that sort of thing than I." At the mention of his wife, Jarvis turned down the ends of his mouth in a grimace. He had no patience for Annabel, a silly, half-mad imbecile who belonged in Bedlam. He grunted.
"Women like Annabel dispense soup to the poor and shed tears over the plight of orphans in the streets because it's an easy sop to their consciences. Nauseating, perhaps, yet ultimately harmless. But you spend your days with your nose stuck in books, researching theories and advocating schemes that could almost be described as radical."
Hero's fine grey eyes narrowed with a hint of a smile. "Oh, believe me, some of my schemes are most definitely radical." Jarvis pushed to his feet and turned to face her.
"The most powerful men in London quake in terror at the thought of annoying me, yet my own daughter openly behaves in ways she knows full well displease me. Why is that?"
"Because I'm too much like you." He grunted. If she were a son, he would be proud of her intellect and her force of character, if not her political notions. But she was not a son. She was a woman, and lately she'd been looking strained. He studied her pale, unusually thin face.
"You've not been looking your best these past few weeks, Hero."
"Dear Papa." She leaned forward to kiss his cheek. She was tall enough to do it without standing on tiptoe. "Surely you know better than to tell a woman she's off her looks." He allowed himself to be coaxed into a smile and pressed her shoulder in a rare gesture of affection. But all he said was,
"I didn't kill your meddlesome bishop."
"Then who did?"
"That I don't know. And neither, to be frank, do I care."
Leaving her father in the library, Hero hurried up the stairs to her bedroom, yanked her chamber pot from its cupboard, and was wretchedly sick. She'd learned the sickness normally came upon her first thing in the morning, although it could strike unexpectedly at any time. She was not a woman accustomed to feeling either fear or vulnerability. But as she settled on the floor, her eyes squeezed shut, her damp forehead pressed against the cupboard door, Hero found herself perilously close to succumbing to both. For a young Englishwoman of her station to bear a child out of wedlock was the ultimate unforgivable disgrace. It mattered not how powerful or wealthy her family, or how bizarre the circumstances that had led her to such a fate. The result could only be social ostracism, complete and everlasting. Hero had always considered herself an independent-minded woman, but even she could not contemplate such a fate with equanimity. Her options were depressing and limited. She could contract a quick, convenient marriage. She could give birth in secret and give the child away. Or she could eliminate herself in a decorous act of self-destruction. Since Hero had no patience with suicides and refused under any circumstances to submit herself to the power of a husband, she was left with only one real option: a secret birth. The results of such births were typically dumped anonymously on the parish or some desperate peasant family, either of which could generally be relied upon to kill the unwanted infant within a year. But Hero had no intention of abandoning the child growing within her to such a short, brutal life. And so she had approached her friend Bishop Prescott for his assistance in locating a good, loving family. Such arrangements were dangerous, since they could be difficult to keep hidden, but she had found Prescott both supportive and blessedly non-judgmental. Now, Prescott was dead, and all her plans were in disarray. At the thought, she felt a new surge of nausea, but suppressed it resolutely. Pushing to her feet, she smoothed her gown, washed her face, and walked down the hall to her mother's chambers. She found Lady Jarvis stretched out upon the daybed in her dressing-room with the drapes closed. She still wore her wrapper, and the left side of her face drooped in that way it had when she was tired. "Didn't you sleep well, Mamma?" asked Hero, bending to kiss her mother's cheek. Her hand dropped to Lady Jarvis's shoulder, and she felt so thin and frail that Hero experienced a new leap of fear. Never well. Lady Jarvis had been especially listless lately. She was nearing 50, a fading shadow of the beautiful, vivacious woman she had once been. Worn out by an endless series of miscarriages and stillbirths, she had succeeded in presenting her lord with only one sickly son and a hale daughter, before suffering a seizure that put an end to her childbearing days and left her weak of mind and body. Now she gripped her daughter's hand and said, "Troublesome dreams, always troublesome dreams." Her soft blue eyes came into focus on Hero's face. "You've been looking tired yourself, Hero. Is something wrong? Are you ill?" Hero felt an unexpected lump in her throat. She had no doubt of her mother's love and devotion, but Lady Jarvis lacked the mental or emotional strength to deal with her own problems, let alone her daughter's. Hero forced a smile. "You know I'm never ill. It's such a lovely day. Shall we go for a walk around the square?" "I don't know if I can, dear." "Of course you can. Let me ring for your woman to help you dress." Disengaging her hand from her mother's grasp, Hero went to open the curtains and give the bell a sharp tug. "It will do you good. I've a quick errand to run, but I should be back by the time you're ready." Lady Jarvis frowned and struggled to sit up. "An errand? What type of errand?" "Oh, nothing of importance," said Hero, who was in fact bound on a very important errand, to the official chambers of the late Bishop Francis Prescott in St. James's Square. Chapter 7. Pale and naked, the body of the Bishop of London lay stretched out upon the slab table in Paul Gibson's secluded outbuilding. Thanks to the thickness of the stone walls, The atmosphere in the low-ceilinged, windowless space was cold and dark, and thickly scented with death. Sebastian paused in the open doorway and took one last gulp of fresh air.
"Ah, there you are," said the surgeon, laying aside a bloody scalpel. "I knew you wouldn't be able to resist this one."
Of medium height, with the dark hair and ready smile of an Irishman, Paul Gibson had known Sebastian for years. Once they'd worn the king's colours and fought together from the mountains of Italy and the peninsula to the West Indies. They might come from different worlds and speak the king's English with markedly different accents, but theirs was a friendship forged in blood and guts and fear.
"Nice to be predictable,"
said Sebastian, eyes blinking at the room's rank air. After only some 14 to 16 hours of death, and most of that during the cool hours of the night, the bishop's corpse was still relatively fresh. The sheet-covered form that rested on a stretcher in the room's far corner was anything but fresh. Limping over to where a chipped enamel basin and pitcher stood on the wooden shelf that ran across the room's back wall, the surgeon splashed water into the basin and rinsed his hands.
"There's no denying it's an interesting puzzle. Two men murdered decades apart in the same place? Not often we see that."
"Judging from the smell, I'd say that's fortunate. Have you found anything yet that might link the two?"
"Not yet. But then,
I've only just started on the bishop. It's definitely the blow to his head that killed him.
not that that'll come as a surprise to anyone who's had a good look at him."
Sebastian studied the corpse before them. The Bishop of London had been a tall man and thin, with long sinewy arms and legs. In his late 50s or early 60s, he had a high forehead and a strong nose, his cheekbones prominent and knife-like beneath the flesh of his face. His hair was completely white, worn straight and unusually long. Even in death, something both scholarly and gentle lingered in his expression.
"Did you know him?"
said Gibson.
"I met him once or twice."
Sebastian examined the gash that disfigured the left side of the bishop's head.
"Sir Henry said they found an iron bar near the body. Do you think it was the murder weapon?"
Gibson nodded to a stout bar, one end gently curved and notched, that lay on the nearby bench.
"I'd say so, yes. It fits the size and shape of the wound very neatly. The blow shattered his skull, tearing the lining of the brain and leaving it exposed. He probably died almost immediately, although it is possible he lived as much as half an hour after he was hit. I doubt he ever regained consciousness, though."
Sebastian glanced up in surprise.
"So he might still have been alive when Reverend Earnshaw found him?" "Possibly. Not that it matters. Even if the Reverend had gone for a doctor rather than the magistrate, there's nothing anyone could have done for him."
Sebastian studied the bishop's long fingers, the nails meticulously manicured and unbroken.
"No sign of a struggle?"
"None." Gibson tossed aside the rough towel he'd been holding.
"The papers are saying the bishop surprised a thief who'd taken advantage of the crypt being open to rob the burials." "I suppose it's a more reassuring tale than the alternative, that someone deliberately bludgeoned the Bishop of London to death."
Gibson looked over at him.
"Any idea who?"
"Not a clue. Not even a suspect." Sebastian hunkered down to study the dead man's bloodied head.
"What could you tell me about his murderer?" "Very little, I'm afraid. Judging from the position of the wound, I'd say the bishop was hit from the front by someone who was right-handed. The assailant was either extraordinarily tall, or the bishop was positioned below him, as if sitting or at least crouching." "What makes you say that?" "If you look closely, you'll notice that the wound isn't exactly on the side of his head. It's up toward the crown. The only way anyone could strike at that angle is if he were standing above the bishop, or if he were considerably taller than the bishop, which is unlikely given that Bishop Prescott was an unusually tall man himself." "You think the bishop could have been crouched down beside him?"
said Sebastian, nodding toward the shrouded form on the stretcher behind them.
"From the way I understand the two men were found,
I'd say that's highly probable. The bishop was lying virtually on top of the earlier victim.
Reluctantly, Sebastian went to draw back the covering from the 18th century corpse and let out his breath in a sharp hiss.
Good God. Fascinating, isn't it?
Said Gibson, limping over to stand beside him.
That's one word for it. I'm afraid I haven't had much of a chance to examine this one yet, but I'm looking forward to it. Really?
Sebastian studied his friend's rapt expression.
You'd love the crypt of St. Margaret's, then?
I would indeed.
What an opportunity.
Sebastian ducked his head to hide a smile. Beneath the froth of lace, the once fine blue velvet coat and the satin waistcoat, the body's sinew had shriveled and sunk. Yet it was obvious that the corpse had belonged to an unusually large man, robust of frame and full of flesh. Time and the action of the chemicals in the crypt had withered and distorted the features of his face, and darkened the skin until he looked like an aged Moor from the mountains of Morocco. Without the chin strap that normally held a burial's jaw closed, his mouth had fallen open in a gaping, hideous yowl. But where once had been eyes were now strange, paper-like wisps.
Old fly pupae, said Gibson, when Sebastian looked up in question.
Sebastian cleared his throat and overcame the urge to draw the covering back up over that horror.
I understand this one was stabbed in the back with a dagger.
That's right. Gibson limped over to retrieve an object from the bench and held it out.
This?
The blackened blade was long and thin, cast in one piece with the handle, then hammer-forged to produce a diamond blade cross-sectioned without any sharpened edges. A stabbing weapon, it was designed not to cut, but to penetrate deeply.
A fine weapon,
said Sebastian, running his thumb along the delicate floral scroll of acanthus leaves and flowers that decorated the handle.
Renaissance, perhaps? I'd say so, yes. Italian.
Sebastian brought his gaze back to the withered cadaver at their feet.
What I want to know is what the hell was our gentleman in velvet and lace doing down in that crypt in the first place?
I don't know. But whatever it was, he obviously wasn't alone. Chapter 8. After allowing his awed tiger a suitable amount of time to gape at the mummified corpse in Gibson's dissection room, Sebastian drove to St. James's Square, where a vast mansion known as London House served as both the London residence and the official chambers of the Bishop of London. A thick layer of straw had already been laid on the street outside of number 32. The blinds were drawn at all the windows, and every opening had been hung with black crape. When Sebastian rang the heavy iron bell, a sepulchral-looking servant ushered him into a darkened entry. A hushed voice behind him said, "Lord Devlin, I take it?" Sebastian turned to find a lean, flaxen-haired cleric regarding him from the doorway of the small chapel that lay just to the right of the entrance.
Yes.
The cleric stepped forward in a waft of incense. "I am Dr. Simon Ashley, the bishop's chaplain. The archbishop has asked me to render you whatever assistance is necessary to expedite your endeavours to make sense of this dreadful tragedy."
"Thank you," said Sebastian.
The chaplain laced his fingers together and bowed. Somewhere in his late 30s or early 40s, he had a fine-boned, delicate face, and the pale complexion of a man whose life was lived indoors. To the uninitiated, the position of chaplain might seem a lowly office. It was not. Bishop Prescott had once served as chaplain to the Bishop of Winchester, while the current Archbishop of Canterbury had been chaplain to the Bishop of Durham. Serving as a bishop's chaplain was an important step up the ecclesiastical ladder. "I assume you'll wish to begin with—" The chaplain broke off, his thin nose twitching.
"It's the crypt,"
said Sebastian, letting his gaze drift around the entry with its gleaming marble floors, its soaring wall panels, its rows of heavy oils framed in gilt and hung with more black crape. Yards and yards of black crape. I'm told the odour lingers.
Yes. Well.
The chaplain cleared his throat and gestured with one hand toward the stairs.
The bishop's official chambers are this way, if you'll come with me.
Sebastian followed the black-robed man up the grand staircase, their footsteps echoing in the stillness of the vast house.
The bishop was here yesterday?
Most of the day, yes,
said the chaplain, pausing on the first floor to throw open the doors to a set of apartments to the left of the stairs.
He had a number of appointments. We weren't scheduled to move to Lambeth Palace, the bishop's summer residence, for another fortnight.
These rooms, like those below, were in shadow, the blinds drawn fast. But Sebastian's eyes were unusually well adapted to the dark. Pausing just inside the entrance, he let his gaze wander over the wainscoted anteroom, its gilded velvet-covered benches and unlit branches of wax candles in gleaming brass sconces. Beyond the anteroom lay a second, smaller chamber with a broad desk. Sebastian had taken 2 steps toward it when the chaplain cleared his throat again.
You'll understand, of course, that ecclesiastical affairs are often of a, shall we say, delicate nature.
Sebastian looked around.
Meaning?
Meaning the Archbishop has delegated to me the task of going through the bishop's papers. I can assure you that if I find anything that appears relevant to his death, I will, of course, pass it on to you.
In other words, the Archbishop would rather I refrain from rifling through the bishop's drawers? Is that what you're saying?
The chaplain gave a nervous titter, but didn't contradict him. Sebastian wandered the rooms, his hands clasped behind his back. The chaplain trailed at a distance of 6 or 7 feet, a handkerchief pressed surreptitiously to his nose. But there was little enough for Sebastian to see. As an administrator, Prescott had obviously possessed a passion for neatness. The surface of his desk was clean and polished, every drawer carefully closed. If the bishop had any skeletons in his life, he'd kept them tucked away, out of sight.
What about the bishop's private apartments? Said Sebastian.
They're upstairs, this way.
The bishop's private chambers on the 2nd floor were more relaxed and informal, for it was here that Prescott had passed his leisure hours. A riding quirt and a pair of gloves rested beside a snuff-box on the gleaming surface of the inlaid round table at the centre of the room, as if their owner had just stepped out and would return in a moment. Near the hearth, a book lay open across the arm of an overstuffed chair. Sebastian glanced at the title, The Libation Bearers, by Aeschylus. He turned in a slow circle. Most of the walls not taken up with windows were covered by vast floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Running his gaze over the titles, he was surprised to see the works of Cicero and Aristotle, Plato and Seneca, nestled beside the more predictable volumes on Aquinas and Augustine.
An interesting collection, said Sebastian.
The bishop began his career as a classics scholar at Christ's College in Cambridge.
He had no family?
A nephew only. His wife passed away some 8 or 9 years ago. There were never any children.
Was he close to his nephew?
Very. Sir Peter was like a son to him.
Sebastian swung around to look back at the chaplain.
The bishop's nephew is Sir Peter Prescott.
That's right. You know him?
We were at Eton together.
Sebastian remembered Sir Peter Prescott as an ebullient, good-natured boy with ruddy cheeks and a ready laugh that hid a quiet streak of mule-headed obstinacy. Aloud he said,
At exactly what time did Reverend Earnshaw reach London with news of the discovery in the crypt?
Reverend Earnshaw arrived shortly after 5, but as he was closeted with the bishop in private, the details of his conversation with the bishop were unknown to us.
The chaplain's thin nose quivered with indignation at what he obviously considered a personal slight. Even when the bishop ordered his carriage for later that evening, he remained uncharacteristically secretive as to the exact nature of his errand. Sebastian frowned. When did Earnshaw leave? Some 20 minutes after his arrival. Yet the bishop himself didn't set out for Tanfield Hill until, 7? Tanfield Hill lay an hour's drive to the west of London. Why the delay? The chaplain sniffed. Again, the bishop did not take me into his confidence. I do know he had an important appointment scheduled for 6. Presumably he was reluctant to cancel it. There was a simple opening cut into the wall beside the hearth. Going to stand in the doorway, Sebastian saw that it led to a small bedchamber, unexpectedly plain, almost Spartan. The bed narrow and hard. He said, "It seems a strange thing for Earnshaw to have done, to involve the Bishop of London personally in the discovery of a decades-old murder in a rural parish church." The chaplain cleared his throat. Unfortunately, the bishop provided us with little information before his departure. Only that there was an incident in Tanfield Hill requiring his attention, and that he might not return before midnight. He didn't mention the murder. No. Sebastian cast one last glance around the rooms, then turned toward the stairs, the chaplain following at a noticeable distance. As they reached the first floor, Sebastian said, "How long have you served as Prescott's chaplain?" 4 years now. So you knew him well? The chaplain gave a slight bow. Quite well, yes. Did he have many enemies? Sebastian expected a quick automatic denial. Instead, the chaplain said, "The bishop was not a man to back away from taking an unpopular stance. Unfortunately, such men do make enemies. Many enemies." What kind of unpopular stances are we talking about? Catholic emancipation, the need for child labor laws, slavery. Prescott was an abolitionist. It was his principal cause. The Bishop of London is responsible for the spiritual welfare of the colonies, and Bishop Prescott took that aspect of his duties very seriously. As far as he was concerned, seeing the Slave Trade Act passed a few years ago was only the beginning. He was determined to get a Slavery Abolition Act through Parliament. That's definitely a good way to make enemies, said Sebastian. Some very powerful men in England had fortunes sunk in the West Indies. The loss of the island's slave labour would ruin them. Ever hear anyone wish the bishop harm? You mean threaten him? The chaplain paused at the base of the staircase, his brow furrowing as if he were in thought. But he only shook his head and said, "No, I don't think so." Sebastian studied the cleric's lean, acerbic face. The man was a terrible liar. I'd be interested to see a list of the bishop's appointments for the past several weeks. The chaplain sniffed. I will check with the archbishop. If he has no objection, I'll direct the diary secretary to make you a copy of the bishop's schedule. He nodded to a hovering footman to open the front door. You're actually the second person today to ask for that information. Oh? Who was the first? Said Sebastian, pausing at the top of the front steps to look back. One of the Bow Street magistrates? No. Miss Hero Jarvis. The chaplain raised his handkerchief to his nose. Good day, my lord. He threw a speaking glance at the footman, who quietly shut the door between them. Sebastian stood for a moment, staring out over the wide square, with its vast central reflecting pool and statue of King Charles. Then he raised the cuff of his coat to his nose and sniffed. Chapter 9. His face crinkled in a pantomime of distaste,
Sebastian's valet lifted the discarded coat of dark superfine on one carefully curled finger and held it at arm's length. "I know," said Sebastian, not looking up from the serious business of tying a fresh cravat. "Do what you can to get the smell out, but if it doesn't work, burn it." Jules Calhoun drew back in mock astonishment. "What? You mean to say you don't fancy walking around London smelling like 100-year-old cadaver?" 100 years might be all right. It's the in-between stages that are the smelliest. The valet gave a soft laugh. A small, slim gentleman's gentleman in his 30s, Calhoun had started life in one of the most notorious flash houses in London, a beginning that had left him with an undeniable flair and a variety of useful connections to the city's underworld. Assembling the rest of Sebastian's discarded raiment, Calhoun bundled the offending clothes together and said, "Are you likely to be returning to St. Margaret's?" "Possibly." "Then I suggest we keep these." Sebastian smoothed the folds of his cravat. "Good point." The valet watched Sebastian slide a slim dagger into the sheath hidden inside his right boot. "Expecting trouble?" Sebastian straightened his cuffs. "When I'm dealing with the Jarvises?" "Always." Most daughters of the upper 10,000 spent their days shopping on Bond Street or attending a dizzying round of picnics, Venetian breakfasts, and morning visits. Not Miss Hero Jarvis. When Sebastian tracked her down, she was at the Royal Hospital in Chelsea. A vast red brick complex, designed by Sir Christopher Wren and clustered around several wide courtyards, the hospital had been established by Charles II for the relief of the nation's wounded and aged war veterans back in the 17th century. But after decades of continuous war, the facility was now grossly underfunded and overcrowded. He'd heard that Miss Jarvis had made the improvement of the hospital one of her projects. As he crossed the sun-drenched main courtyard, he saw her step out of the chapel in the company of a stout gentleman with a swooping auburn moustache and the officious air of a physician. She was dressed in an emerald green walking gown ruched at the hem and finished with darker piping at the neck and sleeves, and carried a delicate silk parasol in a matching shade of green that she tipped at just the right angle to shade her face. A grey-gowned maid, fists clutching the strings of her reticule, hovered at a respectable distance. "Ah, there you are, Miss Jarvis," said Sebastian, walking up to her. "If I might have a word with you." She swung her head to look at him, her lips parting on a quickly indrawn breath. She was a striking woman, with her father's aquiline nose and intelligent grey stare. Now, in her 25th year, she had medium brown hair she usually wore scraped back in an unbecoming fashion better suited to a governess. But lately, she'd taken to having a few wisps cut so that they fell artfully about her forehead. The effect was one of unexpected, misleading softness. None knew better than Sebastian that there was little that was soft about Hero Jarvis. She might be disconcerted to see him, but she recovered almost immediately. "I'm sorry, my lord," she said, "but Dr. McCain here has most graciously offered to escort me on a tour of the facilities, and I wouldn't want to inconvenience—" "I'm convinced the good doctor will excuse us for a moment," said Sebastian, giving the stout physician a smile that bared his teeth. "Of course," said the doctor, withdrawing immediately with a polite bow. "My efforts here are important," she told Sebastian in a low voice, as they turned to stroll together across the paved courtyard. "It is beyond shameful for a nation of our wealth and grandeur to ask men to risk life and limb in war, and then abandon them to poverty and neglect when they return home wounded and infirm." "Believe me, Miss Jarvis, I have nothing but admiration for what you're trying to accomplish. I won't delay you long." He studied her classical profile. She looked thinner and paler than he remembered. Once, just 2 months before, Sebastian had held this woman in his arms, tasted the salt of her tears, felt the shudders rack her unexpectedly yielding body. But that had been a moment out of time, when they thought they faced certain death together. Instead, they had survived. Now those shared moments of weakness had become a source of embarrassment and regret that could have profound repercussions for them both. He'd known her to shoot a highwayman at point-blank range, to confront certain death with a rare and clear-headed fortitude. But for a young gentlewoman, to face the potential shame and ostracism of an unwed birth was something else entirely, and he had no intention of allowing her to suffer alone for what they had done together. The problem was, he wasn't convinced she would tell him if there were, in fact, repercussions from that fateful afternoon. "Are you well?" he asked. She knew precisely what he meant. "I'm quite well, thank you." She kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, her step never faltering. "You've no need to concern yourself." He wanted to believe her, but couldn't. She'd already given him her forthright opinion of marriage. When he'd offered her the protection of his name after their rescue that day, her answer had been swift and unequivocal. Studying the self-possessed features of the woman beside him now, he could find no trace of the vulnerable creature who'd given herself to him in the cold, dark vaults beneath Somerset House. Yet it had happened. He said, "The Archbishop of Canterbury has asked me to look into the murder of Bishop Prescott." For an instant, the hand holding the parasol clenched so hard Sebastian heard the delicate bamboo crack. The calm self-control of her voice never slipped. "Bishop Prescott," she said airily. "And what, pray tell, does his death have to do with me?" "I don't know, which is why I was curious when I heard you had requested a copy of Prescott's most recent appointments." She stared off across the courtyard to where an emaciated man with one leg hobbled on a single crutch. "Ah," she said softly. "And now you're wondering why, are you?" "Yes." She kept her gaze on the wounded soldier in his gay, old-fashioned uniform. "In point of fact, it's my belief the bishop was being blackmailed." "Blackmailed?" Whatever Sebastian had been expecting her to say, it wasn't that. "Yes." "And precisely what, Miss Jarvis, led you to this conclusion?" "When I met with the bishop yesterday evening, I found him quite disturbed." "You had a meeting with Prescott?" She glanced sideways at him. "You hadn't discovered that yet?" "No, I had not. At what time did you meet with him?" 6. "So you were the important appointment the bishop was reluctant to cancel. Do you mind if I ask why you were meeting with the Bishop of London?" She twitched her parasol back and forth in short, sharp jerks. "You may ask if you wish, my lord, but I have no intention of answering your question. Believe me, it is not at all relevant to your investigation." "Perhaps," he said quietly, "but I will find out, you know." She swung to face him, her jaw set, her eyes icy with dislike. "Very well, if you insist. The bishop asked for my assistance in preparing the speech he was to give before the House of Lords this Thursday." Sebastian studied the smooth line of her cheek, the dark sweep of lashes that half hid her eyes as she looked away. She was a very good liar, but not quite good enough. He said, "The speech on abolition." "That's right." Sebastian shifted his gaze to the statue of Charles II, decked out like a Roman emperor, that stood in the centre of the court. If his understanding of the events of that evening were correct, then Miss Jarvis would have arrived at London House not long after the Reverend Malcolm Earnshaw's meeting with the bishop. But Sebastian found it difficult to understand how there could have been anything in the discovery of a decades-old corpse in a small village church to rattle a man as powerful and worldly as the Bishop of London. He said, "Did Prescott tell you he was being blackmailed?" "Not in so many words." "So what precisely did he say that led you to such an unlikely conclusion?" "I'm sorry, but I can't tell you that." "You—" He caught himself up short, took a deep breath, and said more calmly,
Miss Jarvis, do I need to remind you that a man is dead?
She held herself very still. Obviously not, my Lord Devlin. But Francis Prescott was my friend. He told me what he did in strictest confidence, and I do not believe that a man's death relieves his friends of their responsibility to respect his desire for privacy. He stared at her.
You would respect the bishop's confidence, even if it meant letting his killer go free.
Her nostrils flared on a quickly indrawn breath. No. But if I can preserve the bishop's confidence by making some preliminary inquiries myself, then would you not agree that it is incumbent upon me to do so? If I should discover that the information I have is relevant to his death, then I shall, of course, disclose it to you.
Hence your request for the list of the bishop's appointments.
Yes. He watched her glance away again. She might be telling him the truth, but he had a nasty suspicion it was only a half-truth. He said,
Blackmailers don't necessarily make appointments, you know.
Her nostrils flared. That had occurred to me.
And were you looking for anyone's name in particular on that list?
In point of fact, I have not yet received the list. Sebastian tightened his jaw.
And when you do receive the list, Miss Jarvis, whose name do you anticipate finding upon it?
He didn't expect her to answer him, but to his surprise, a faint, unpleasant smile curled her lips, and she said, Lord Quillian's.
Quillian? Surely you don't suspect Lord Quillian of murdering the bishop?
One eyebrow arched. You find that so improbable?
The man is a fop. He wears his shirt point so high he can barely turn his head, and his coats are so tight I swear the seams would split if he tried to bludgeon anyone to death.
You might think so. Yet he has fought 2 duels
20 years ago.
And he is an outspoken opponent of abolition.
As are any number of other men in London.
True. Yet how many of those men went so far as to actually threaten the bishop? Sebastian frowned.
Quillian threatened the bishop. Did Prescott tell you so?
She shook her head. He had no need. I was walking with the bishop in Hyde Park on Saturday when Lord Quillian accosted him.
Accosted?
Yes, accosted. He warned the bishop specifically to give up his support of the Slavery Abolition Act, saying that men who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones.
That might not necessarily have been a threat.
Perhaps. Except he followed it up by saying, Beware lest your own house should shatter, my Lord Bishop. Sebastian glanced over to where Tom was walking the greys up and down the lane near the overgrown entrance to the old Ranelagh Gardens.
You know, of course, that I shall now accost Lord Quillian.
I should sincerely hope so. Why else do you suppose I told you? He grunted.
You don't actually believe that aging exquisite has anything to do with the bishop's death, do you?
On the contrary, I do, she said, and turned to walk back toward the chapel. He fell into step beside her again.
You say the bishop was your friend?
He was.
So tell me about him.
She stared off across the court to where the stout, mustachioed physician waited patiently with his hands clasped behind his back. Studying her face, Sebastian saw her features contort with an unmistakable pinch of grief. How do you reduce such a vital, complex man to just a few words? He was the most intensely compassionate, caring man I've ever known.
I've heard he was an advocate for reform.
A strange, sad smile hovered about her lips. I am an advocate for reform. Francis Prescott was that, and so much more. I've seen him give his own coat to a woman he found freezing in the street, and stop his carriage to personally take into his arms the filthy, starving child someone had abandoned at the side of the road.
He sounds like a veritable saint.
A saint. She thought about it. No, not a saint. He was a man, like anyone else.
So he had faults.
We all have faults, my Lord Devlin.
And what were Bishop Prescott's faults?
She looked vaguely troubled. I suppose he could at times be accused of behaving uncharitably towards those of French or American origins. He looked at her in surprise.
Because of those two countries' revolutions.
But I thought Prescott was an advocate of reform. Reform, yes. Revolution, no. The violence of the French and American revolutions horrified him, although I think there was more to it than that. He lost 3 of his own brothers in the wars of the last century, one fighting the French in Canada, one fighting the French in India, and the third fighting the American rebels.
A very martial family for a bishop.
She glanced over at him. It's what younger sons do, is it not? Take the cloth or buy a pair of colours. Sebastian gave a wry smile. As the youngest of 3 sons born to the Earl of Hendon, Sebastian himself had been destined for a career in the army before the deaths of his 2 older brothers thrust him into the position of heir. Once he became Viscount Devlin, there'd been no more talk of his making a career of the military. Hendon had been furious and terrified when Sebastian went off to spend some 6 years fighting the French anyway. He said, "Did you know Prescott was planning to drive out to Tanfield Hill last night, after your meeting with him?" She shook her head. "He never mentioned it." They were almost back to where Dr. McCain and Hero's maid waited patiently beside the doors to the chapel. She slowed and swung to face him. "Now you really must excuse me, my lord. There is nothing more I can tell you."
Can't or won't?
She raised one eyebrow in an expression that was disconcertingly evocative of her father. "Does it matter?" she said, and brushed past him, her parasol tilted at just the right angle, her chin held high, her back uncompromisingly straight and rigid. Chapter 10. Sebastian had no doubt Miss Jarvis was more than capable of tossing the Prince Regent's well-dressed friend Lord Quillian to the proverbial lions, if that was what it took to distract attention from whatever she herself was trying to hide. But on the off chance the middle-aged exquisite might indeed have been involved in the Bishop of London's untimely demise, Sebastian spent the better part of the afternoon tracking the dandy through the fashionable male shopping precincts of Bond Street, Jermyn Street, and Savile Row. He finally ran Quillian to ground in the discreet premises of Schweitzer and Davison on Cork Street. A slim man of medium height, with lean cheeks, an aquiline nose, and heavily lidded green eyes, Lord Quillian was of the same generation as the Prince. Born a second son, he had come into his inheritance late in his 20s, on the death of his older brother. Like so many of the Prince's cohorts, the Baron was addicted to games of chance, to free-flowing wine and free-spirited women. But his ruling passion was fashion. The vast majority of his time, as well as much of his considerable fortune, being expended on the arraignment of his person. When Sebastian came upon him, Quillian was dressed in fawn-coloured breeches of the finest doeskin and a flawlessly tailored coat with silver buttons. He had a silver-headed ebony walking stick tucked up under one arm and was pensively debating with his tailor the rival merits of superfine and Bath coating.
"I hear the beau swears by the Bath coating," said Sebastian.
"True," said Quillian,
"but then Brummel began his career as a hussar. Once a military man, always a military man."
Glancing sideways, the Baron frowned at Sebastian's own well-tailored but nonchalant rig.
"I dare say you order your coats from Myers on Conduit Street, and always in Bath coating."
"Frequently, yes."
"Well, there, you see?"
He nodded to the tailor,
Let's say the superfine, shall we?"
Mr. Schweitzer gave an obsequious bow and withdrew.
"Walk with me away,"
said Sebastian, falling into step beside the exquisite as they left the shop. The aging roue cast a dubious eye at the sun shining brightly from the clear sky.
"Well, I can walk with you to the end of the street, I suppose. But then I fear I really must call a chair. I'm frightfully susceptible to the sun, you know. If I'm not careful, I quickly turn as brown as a savage."
Sebastian blinked at the exquisite's creamy white complexion.
"Just so."
He waited while the dandy paused to inspect the tray of buttons displayed in a nearby shop window, then added,
"I assume you've heard of the death of the Bishop of London."
The Baron gave a delicate shudder and moved on.
"Who, pray tell, has not? The description in the Morning Post nearly brought on my spasms. Not that I ever had anything but the utmost contempt for the man himself, but still, violence of any sort is so crude. Yet I've heard it said you fought 2 duels yourself when you were younger."
Quillian gave a tight smile, the sleepy eyes suddenly looking considerably less lazy.
"Surely you don't mean to conflate what happened to Prescott with a duel conducted under the gentleman's code? I mean, to have one's head bashed in is so, well, plebeian, wouldn't you say? Not to mention fatal." "I suppose,"
Quillian sniffed.
"Although it's Prescott's own fault, really. He should have thought of the consequences before." "Before what?" "Why, before he set about putting up the backs of half the men in town, of course." "I hear you quarrelled rather publicly with the bishop yourself. Last Saturday, was it not? In Hyde Park?"
Sebastian added, when the exquisite continued to stare at him blankly.
"Oh, that."
Quillian waved the incident away with the flap of one slim hand gloved in snowy white kid.
"Yes, that. Over abolition, I assume."
Quillian sniffed.
"The bloody righteous idiot was trying to push a Slavery Abolition Act through Parliament. If you ask me, even to suggest such a measure in time of war is tantamount to treason. The financial repercussions from that kind of foolishness would be ruinous. For you. For England. I suppose the bishop believed he laboured in the service of a higher power. The man was a fool."
Sebastian watched the Baron's hand tighten around the silver head of his walking stick. Sebastian owned a similar piece, the ornate handle unscrewed to reveal a long, slim dagger. He said,
"I've heard speculation that someone may have been trying to blackmail Prescott. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" "Blackmail? Truly?"
Quillian's lips stretched into a thin, tight smile, but his eyes were hard.
"Are you suggesting there was something in his righteousness's past that could have left the man open to blackmail? How very entertaining. If only one had known of this sooner, one might have made use of it."
Sebastian studied the exquisite's carefully powdered face.
"You're saying you don't know of anything in the bishop's past that might have made him vulnerable to blackmail?" "Blackmail is so sordid. Don't you agree?"
"Like murder," said Sebastian.
"Exactly. If you want my opinion, and I take it you must, since you have obviously sought me out to discuss this dreadful matter, the authorities could do worse than to look into the movements of that horrid colonial."
"Colonial? You mean an American?"
"That's right. Franklin, I believe his name is. I understand he used to be governor of New Jersey or some such place before the recent unpleasantness."
"You mean William Franklin? Benjamin Franklin's son?"
"Yes, that's the one. He was leaving the bishop's chambers just as I arrived on Monday afternoon."
You saw the bishop this past Monday."
"I did," said the dandy, swinging his walking stick by the handle. "It was my hope to persuade the bishop of the advisability of giving up his intention of delivering an impassioned attack on slavery before the Lords this Thursday."
"By appealing to his better nature."
"Hardly. By threatening to have him blackballed from his clubs."
Quillian sniffed.
"You'll agree, I assume, that there is considerable difference between threatening to blackball a man and threatening to blackmail him,
Actually, threatening to blackball a man struck Sebastian as a form of blackmail, but all he said was, "And Franklin?"
"As I said, the man was leaving as I arrived. Their exchange had obviously been heated, for as I entered the antechamber, I heard the bishop say it would be a dark day in hell before he ever had dealings with a traitor's son. To which Franklin replied—"
Here the exquisite hesitated, as if suddenly overcome by an 11th-hour attack of scruples at the realization that he might be implicating a man in murder. Sebastian dutifully prompted, "Yes?"
To which Franklin replied, "Hell is where men such as yourself belong."
Quillian glanced over at Sebastian expectantly. Sebastian said, "You're suggesting, I take it, that Franklin meant it as a threat?"
"Well, it could certainly be construed as such, could it not?"
"Perhaps. You wouldn't have any idea what their exchange was about?"
"I'm afraid not."
Quillian brought the back of one hand to his forehead.
"Merciful heavens, I do believe I am in danger of beginning to perspire. This is all your fault, you know. Expecting me to walk down the street like some milkmaid making deliveries."
He raised his voice.
"Chair! Chair, I say!"
A couple of chairmen, lounging before a nearby public house, jerked to attention and rushed toward him.
"Carlton House,"
said Quillian, settling back against the sedan chair's quilted squabs. "One more thing," said Sebastian, resting a hand on the chair frame to delay him. "Exactly where were you last night?"
Quillian's eyes widened in a show of indignation. "Why, with the Prince."
"All evening?"
"Of course,"
he snapped, and nodded to the chairman to move on. Sebastian took a step back, his eyes narrowing against the glare of the sun as he watched the chairman trot away. Chapter 11. One hand wrapped tightly around her kite's spar, the young girl raced down the grassy slope at the edge of Green Park, knees kicking against the muslin of her simple gown. She was a plain child, somewhere between 12 and 14 years of age, with the nondescript brown hair and plump cheeks of her famous forebear, Benjamin Franklin. As Sebastian watched, the breeze filled the kite's red sails, flapping the silk. She held tight, shouting with delight to the small rotund man who loped ahead of her. William Franklin held a stout stick wound with the kite's line in one hand, the other hand playing out the twine as he ran. He was dressed in the frock coat and buckled breeches of an earlier age, his stocking-clad calves flashing in short, rapid steps as he hollered, "Now!" The girl leapt up, releasing the kite. For a moment it dipped, threatening to crash to earth. Then the wind caught the sails and it soared high, a crimson splash against the clear blue sky. "Take the line, quickly!" shouted William Franklin, holding out the stick. She snatched at it with a gay laugh, her skirts swirling around her as she raced across the park, the kites sailing above her. Breathing heavily, Franklin bent to rest his hands on his knees. His plump cheeks were flushed and damp, but his small eyes danced with merriment as his gaze followed the plain, brown-haired girl with the kite. "Your granddaughter," said Sebastian, walking up to him. The old man straightened. "Ellen. I've raised her myself from the time she was a wee babe." His eyes narrowed. "I know you, don't I?"
Yes, although I'm surprised you remember me. The name's Devlin, said Sebastian, shaking the elderly gentleman's hand. I came to one of your lectures on the Gulf Stream many years ago.
William Franklin nodded to the girl with the kite.
It was Ellen's father, my son Temple, who helped my father chart the stream, you know, on a voyage between London and America. I know. You've an interest in water currents?
They turned to walk together across the grass.
I believe a man should strive to remain aware of the scientific advances of his day, yes. Yet somehow I don't think you've sought me out to talk about water temperatures, have you, Lord Devlin?
At the use of his title, Sebastian shifted to face the small American. Franklin smiled.
I knew your father many years ago, although I doubt he ever told you of our acquaintance.
No,
he didn't.
Franklin's head turned as he followed his granddaughter's progress across the park.
We shared a ship's voyage together, once. Lord Hendon had been visiting the colonies while I was beginning my life of exile.
He was silent a moment. The humour that had briefly animated his features had gone, leaving his face bleak and sorrowful.
I'd just lost my first wife. She died while I was being held in a rebel prison.
He let out a heavy sigh and shook his head.
I must beg your pardon for sounding maudlin. The older I get, the more memory of those days lies heavily upon my heart.
They stood together, heads thrown back as they watched the kite dip and soar above them. After a moment, Franklin said,
You're here because of Bishop Prescott, I assume.
Sebastian glanced over at him.
How did you know?
Franklin tapped one snuff-stained finger against his temple.
I'm not in my dotage yet. You might have a passing interest in science, but your real passion is murder. It's not difficult to infer that someone told you I exchanged heated words with the Bishop of London recently. It's true, then? Oh, yes. Just because I'm not in my dotage doesn't mean I can't be foolish.
Sebastian shook his head.
I don't understand. I run an informal school for some local children. Nothing fancy, just a small group of lads who gather in my parlor for an hour or so in the evening to learn the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic. Ever since my Mary died, I've been finding it more and more difficult to keep the sessions going. I knew Prescott was an advocate of education for the poor, so I was hoping he might be able to find a place for a couple of the brighter boys in one of the city's charity schools.
His lips tightened into a thin line.
I should have known better. He refused. He wouldn't even hear me out. Became abusive, really, as I've no doubt you've heard.
They turned to walk together down the hill.
Ironic, isn't it?
Said Franklin.
My own father disowned me as a traitor because I chose to remain loyal to the king he raised me to serve. But Prescott, as far as he was concerned, my father's loyalty to the land of his birth makes me a traitor.
Sebastian was silent, trying to reconcile two seemingly irreconcilable portraits of the bishop, the dedicated philanthropist and the narrow-minded bigot. A faint smile rekindled in the depths of the American's eyes.
I see by your expression you don't believe me. You think, how could a man who fought for everyone from the poor slaves of the West Indies to the downtrodden Catholics of Ireland be so unreasonable in his dealings with an old man? I suppose we all have our prejudices, said Sebastian. We do indeed. Prescott may have been a reformer, but he was no radical. As far as he was concerned, France and America were ungodly places, united by revolution and a dangerous philosophy he considered a threat to the future of civilization. But your own loyalty to England never wavered. It didn't matter. Prescott looked at me and he saw my father. For him, that was enough. The war with America ended nearly 30 years ago.
Franklin shrugged.
For some, the passage of time means little.
He swung to face Sebastian again, his pale, watery eyes blinking in the bright sunlight.
If you want my advice, my lord, you'll look at more than the past few days if you want to find out who killed the Bishop of London. Some men keep their friends for a lifetime. But Francis Prescott, he preserved his enemies forever. Do you have any idea who some of those enemies might have been? Me? No.
Franklin's granddaughter was beginning to reel in her kite, the crimson silk dancing against the clear blue sky. He watched it, eyes squinted against the light, his features set in troubled lines. After a moment he said,
"There is one rather curious aspect of my meeting with the bishop."
"Yes?"
"When I arrived at London House, I found the bishop paused on the footpath in conversation with a tradesman, a butcher. Prescott said the man was simply there over an account, but—"
"You didn't believe him?"
"When was the last time you dealt with your butcher over an account?"
Sebastian smiled.
"I dare say I wouldn't recognize the man if I passed him on the street."
"Precisely."
"Had you ever seen the man before?" "As a matter of fact, yes, I recognized him. He's a fellow by the name of Slade, Jack Slade. He has a shop near Smithfield."
"Smithfield?" Franklin nodded.
"Near the cathedral, although I'm afraid I couldn't tell you his exact direction. I remembered the incident because it was obvious the encounter troubled the bishop, deeply troubled him. I suspect it does much to explain why he reacted so angrily to my own request."
The wind gusted up, then suddenly died. Tipping back his head, Sebastian watched the kite falter, red wings vivid against the blue sky. Ellen Franklin let out a squeal as the kite plummeted downward, silk flapping, to land upside down in the branches of an elm tree, a torn scarlet splash against a sea of green.
"I want you to find someone for me," Sebastian told his tiger. "A Smithfield butcher by the name of Jack Slade."
Tom's eyes brightened.
"Aye, Governor. Any idea what part of the area he hails from?"
Sebastian gathered the grey's reins.
"No."
Tom gave a cheery laugh and hopped down from his perch at the rear of the curricle.
"I'll find him, Governor. Ne'er you fear."
Chapter 12. Hero spent what was left of the day prowling the big Jarvis townhouse on Berkeley Square and awaiting the arrival of Bishop Prescott's appointment schedule from London House. The discovery that the Archbishop of Canterbury had asked Viscount Devlin to investigate Prescott's death filled her with a driving sense of urgency. She knew Devlin, which meant she knew it was only a matter of time before he discovered the truth behind her recent visits to the bishop. And once he knew that, she had no doubt he would be relentless in his determination to do the honourable thing and marry her. Wild and unorthodox Devlin might be, but he was still an officer and a gentleman, and in affairs of this nature, the gentleman's code was inflexible. Of course, he could not compel her to marry him. Normally, Hero would have laughed at the suggestion that she might find it difficult to resist him. But she was discovering that pregnancy had the disconcerting effect of making even the strongest of females weak, and, God help her, weepy. There were times, particularly in the dark, sleepless hours just before dawn, when she found herself actually considering such a solution, which made it vitally important that the bishop's murder be solved quickly, before it was too late. That evening, when the papers from London House had still not arrived, she pleaded a headache, which was real enough, and stayed home from a dinner at the Austrian ambassador's. She was convinced the schedule from the bishop's chaplain would arrive at any moment. But it never did. That night, Sebastian dressed in a white silk waistcoat, black tails and knee breeches, and silk stockings, and directed his carriage toward Covent Garden. He arrived late, after the fashionable crush of chattering society members had settled in their private boxes, and after the less than fashionable stampede of those taking advantage of the theatre's practice of selling off all empty gallery seats at half price after the second interval. For the better part of a year, Sebastian had carefully avoided the theatre. Now, as he walked through the dim corridors and up the candlelit staircase, he breathed in the familiar scent of oranges and imagined for one painful moment that he caught the distant echo of a woman's sweet laughter, like a ghost from the past. There had been a time when Cat Boleyn, the most famous actress of the London stage, had been Sebastian's mistress, and the love of his life. Then came the devastating revelations of the previous autumn, when Hendon rediscovered a previously unknown illegitimate daughter, and Sebastian lost forever the woman he'd hoped to make his wife. He knew that painful truth should change the way he felt about Cat, and in many respects it had. But over the last months, he'd been forced to acknowledge that a part of his heart would forever be hers, no matter how damned that might make him in the eyes of God and man. The boxes, although private, were as brilliantly lit as the stage, for one attended the theatre to see and be seen as much as to actually watch the production below. He was aware of heads turning, of whispers behind raised fans as he slipped alone into his box. His many months' absence from the theatre had naturally been marked and speculated upon, coinciding, as it did, with the precipitous marriage of his long-time mistress to a gentleman of dubious reputation and questionable sexuality. Sebastian kept his gaze on the stage below. Resplendent in the red velvet robes of Portia in The Merchant of Venice, Cat was as beautiful as ever, her cheekbones exquisitely high and flaring, her dark hair touched with fire by the gleam of candlelight, her blue, sincere eyes flashing. He watched, his heart aching with need and want, late into the final act. Then he quietly left his seat and headed for the private dressing room he knew so well. He was waiting for her when she swept in after the final curtain call, her eyes sparkling, her cheeks flushed with triumph. Then she saw him and froze. "I'm sorry for coming here," he said, his shoulders braced against the far wall, his arms crossed at his chest. "But I couldn't see presenting myself at your new husband's house, and I need to talk to you." She had full, sensuous lips, a child's nose, and slanting cat's eyes she'd inherited from the woman who'd once stolen Hendon's heart. Eyes she half hid with the downward sweep of her lashes as she closed the door quietly behind her. "You are always welcome there." 9 months before, she had married an ex-privateer named Russell Yates, a dashing nobleman's son with long dark hair, a pirate's gold hoop earring, and a flair for making himself the darling of the ton. But theirs was a marriage of convenience only, for Cat had made herself Jarvis's enemy, and Yates had in his possession proof of a dirty little secret from the powerful man's past. In exchange for protecting Cat from Jarvis, Yates received the cachet of being married to the most beautiful, desirable woman on the London stage, which was important, given that Yates's sexual interests did not run to women. When Sebastian returned no answer, Cat went to settle before her dressing table and began removing pins from her hair. "It must be important. You've been avoiding me for months now." "You know why?" "Yes, I know why." He drew a deep breath, but it did nothing to ease the ache in his chest. He shouldn't have come. He pushed away from the wall. "Last night, someone bashed in the head of the Bishop of London." Her hands stilled at their task. "And you've been drawn into the investigation of his murder?" Sebastian's involvement in cases of murder had always troubled Cat. Of all the people in his life, she knew better than any Better even than Gibson. How much it cost him. Oh, Sebastian. He gave a negligent shrug.
My aunt asked it of me.
Her gaze met his in the mirror, her head tipping sideways. You don't seriously think I was in any way acquainted with the good bishop, of all people?
No, but there is some suggestion he was vulnerable to blackmail. I thought you might know why.
Once she had laboured to aid the country of her mother's birth, Ireland, by passing sensitive information to the agents of England's enemy, France. Ferreting out the secrets of the powerful and influential was an established technique in espionage, which meant that if Bishop Prescott had indeed guarded a dangerous secret, then the representatives of Napoleon in London would have made it their business to know about it. Blackmail could be a powerful tool. She understood at once the implication of his question. I ended those associations months ago. You know that, Sebastian.
Still?
Her gaze held his in the mirror. Still.
But you would know whom to ask.
She took the last pin from her hair, letting it cascade in glorious waves around her shoulders. He had to tighten his fists to keep from reaching out and touching it. She said, I could find out, yes. He turned toward the door.
Thank you.
He had his hand on the knob when she said, Sebastian. He glanced back at her. The flames of the candles at each end of her dressing table fluttered in the draught, dancing poignant shadows across the planes of her face. She said, Sebastian, how are you? Really? He found he had to swallow before answering.
I'm well, thank you.
Her brows drew together in a frown. You look thinner, wilder. He gave a sudden laugh.
At least I've given up trying to drink myself to death.
No answering smile touched her lips. That's an improvement.
And you,
he said, his voice gruff.
How is your marriage?
As I would wish it, she said, which could mean anything or nothing. He closed the door quietly behind him. He stood for a moment in the narrow corridor, breathed in the achingly familiar scents of oranges and grease paint and dust. Then he walked away, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. He arrived back at Brook Street some hours later to find Tom awaiting him in the library.
You shouldn't have stayed up for me,
said Sebastian, holding himself painfully still. Tom's eyes widened, taking in the slightly disordered cravat, the dangerous glitter that told of too many brandies downed too quickly. But all he said was, I found your Jack Slade. He has a shop in Monkwell Street, just off Falcon Square near St. Paul's. Sebastian turned toward the stairs.
Good. We'll pay him a visit first thing in the morning. Best get some sleep.
I asked around the neighbourhood a bit to see what manner of man he is. From what I can tell, he's what you might call an unsavoury character. Him and his son Obadiah, both.
Sebastian paused with one foot on the bottom step. He has a son named Obadiah Slade?
That's right. Giant of a man with a lantern jaw and yellow hair he wears cut short enough to show an ugly scar running across the side of his head. Tom tipped his own head sideways, studying Sebastian's face. Why? You know him?
He was a corporal in my regiment in Portugal. If it had been up to me, he'd have been hanged. As it was, he earned 100 lashes and was cashiered from the army.
Tom's face went suddenly solemn.
What?
Prompted Sebastian. They say he ain't been back in town long, but he's been talking big ever since he got back. About some officer he knew in the army. Some lord's son. Says if he ever sees him again, he's going to kill him. Chapter 13. Thursday, 9th of July, 1812. Early the next morning, Sebastian donned a rough brown corduroy coat and greasy breeches gleaned from the second-hand clothing stalls of Rosemary Lane. Wrapping a coarse black cravat around his neck, he rubbed ashes into his uncombed hair and unshaven cheeks. Under Jules Calhoun's amused eye, he settled an unfashionable round hat low on his head. Then he set out in search of Mr. Jack Slade. Lying to the northeast of St. Paul's Cathedral, Monkwell Street proved to be a narrow lane of small shops that wound uphill toward the noisome churchyard of St. Giles Cripplegate and the vast burial ground beyond it. "There," said Tom, as Sebastian reined in the curricle at the base of the hill. "That's Jack Slade's place, next to the knackery."
Convenient.
"Maybe, if your customers ain't bothered by being reminded of where their victuals come from."
Sebastian eyed his young tiger with astonishment.
"I'd no notion you harboured such exquisite sensibilities."
Tom grunted and took the reins. Jumping down, Sebastian continued up the lane on foot. With each step he sank deeper into the role he intended to play. The grace of the horseman and the swordsman faded away, along with the easy assurance that came unthinkingly to an earl's son. His movements grew heavier, his demeanour pugnacious, argumentative. It was an acting trick Cat Boleyn had taught him years ago, when they'd been young and in love, and blissfully, dangerously ignorant of the shared blood that flowed through their veins. The footpath here was narrow and crowded with a variety of goods spilling from the surrounding shops. Transformed now into Mr. Taylor, constable, Sebastian dodged stacks of tinware, trestle-mounted trays displaying colourful ribbons, a canvas piled with salted cod, whose fishy odour mingled unpleasantly with the stench of freshly spilled blood, and raw meat, coming from the butcher's shop and the knackery beyond. A side of beef, a row of sheep's heads, and what looked like half a hog hung in the open shop front. Ducking beneath the sheep's heads, Sebastian stepped onto a sawdust-covered floor, where flies buzzed over trays of sausages and piles of tripe and blood pudding displayed on a long, scrubbed bench. More flies coated the glistening joints hung from hooks screwed into the wall. Behind the bench, a grizzled-headed man in a bloody apron was hacking at a half-dismembered carcass lying on a thick block. A channel cut into the perimeter of the block caught the blood and drained it into a tin bucket below. As Sebastian's shadow fell across his work, the man glanced up, grunted, and turned away again. He looked to be in his 50s, his face lined and darkened as if by years spent beneath a powerful sun. Several days' growth of grey beard shadowed his lean cheeks and pronounced jaw. His eyes were small and dark and wary beneath beetled brows. He was essentially an older, darker version of the Corporal Obadiah Slade who had once raped a 12-year-old Portuguese girl, then smashed in her head for the sheer joy of watching her die.
"You're Jack Slade,"
said Sebastian, every trace of the aristocratic West End carefully scrubbed from his diction.
"Aye."
Slade worked his cleaver free from between two ribs and then let it fly again. Splat! Small bits of gore splattered over the nearby wall.
"What's it to you?" "I'm told you paid a visit to Bishop Prescott Monday afternoon."
The cleaver hesitated for one betraying instant, then fell heavily.
"What if I did?" "Care to tell us why?"
The butcher kept his gaze on his work, but Sebastian saw an angry muscle tighten along his heavy jaw.
"What you mean, why?"
It's not a particularly obtuse question.
"I'm a simple man."
Splat. You want I should understand you, you'll need to be using simple words.
"Simpler than why?"
Jack Slade sank his cleaver into the side of beef and left it there, quivering. He straightened slowly, uncoiling a big body laced with muscle.
The bishop likes me pork chops, see? I brung him some. It's as simple as that.
It was the most improbable tale Sebastian had ever heard. He said,
You do that often? On occasion? It ain't something I'd do for just anybody, you understand. But the bishop, he was a special customer. He must have been.
Sebastian studied the sheep's heads hanging in the doorway.
Lamb chops, did you say? That's right. So you're saying what? That the bishop didn't like the look of your lamb chops? What's that supposed to mean? Ask anybody on the street, they'll tell you. You want fresh meat, you go to Jack Slade. So maybe you brought him lamb chops when what he really wanted was your pork chops.
The butcher's nostrils flared.
You're trying to be funny, is that it? What I'm trying to do is understand why a visit from a simple butcher would trouble someone like the Bishop of London.
Slade's eyes narrowed.
Who told you my visit troubled the bishop? Does it matter? I suppose not.
Slade turned to pull his cleaver from the half-dismembered carcass.
Except that whoever said it, he's wrong.
Slade kept his gaze fixed on the meat before him. Sebastian kept his gaze on that cleaver. Sebastian said,
So you're suggesting the bishop wasn't distressed? No, I ain't saying that. Fact is, Prescott was already in a high-dander when I seen him. What I'm saying is, it had nothing to do with me.
The man's fist tightened around the cleaver, his jaw clenching belligerently as he spat the words out.
You bulls just won't let a man alone, will you? I done my 14 years in Botany Bay. Lost me poor wife while I was there. Then earned another 7 for a spot of trouble I got into in Sydney town. It took me 3 years on top of all that to earn the wherewithal to buy me passage back home. But I'm a free man now, you hear? And there's nothing the lot of you can do about it. So why don't you get out of here and go bother some other poor sod? The man's sun-darkened skin suddenly made sense. Sebastian said, What were you transported for? Like you don't know. With a flick of the wrist, the butcher sent the cleaver flying to bite into the wooden board between them. It twanged a moment, then stilled. It was murder, wasn't it? I'm closing me shop now, said Slade. Ripping off his bloody apron, he pushed through the ragged curtain that screened an alcove in the back, leaving Sebastian alone with the flies and the stench of raw meat and blood. Sebastian was heading back down the street when he saw Obadiah Slade. The man came charging up the hill, his heavy fists clenched at his sides, his powerful jaw set hard. For one intense moment, he stared straight at Sebastian, but the rough clothes and greyed hair and unmilitary-like bearing confused him. Sebastian saw the man frown as if trying to capture a fleeting memory. Sebastian brushed past him and kept walking. Obadiah Slade hadn't made the connection yet between this unfashionably garbed, subtly older Londoner and the young officer in the peninsula who'd once tried to have him hanged. But eventually it would come. Chapter 14. Never tell me Obadiah Slade is involved in this, said Paul Gibson, glancing up from the naked, eviscerated corpse stretched out on the stone slab before him. Sebastian had driven here to Gibson's surgery on Tower Hill from Monkwell Street. Now he took one look at what Gibson was doing in the 18th century cadaver's bowels and shifted his gaze to the unkempt yard outside. Maybe, maybe not, but his father is definitely hiding something. Is the father anything like the son? Yes. Then I suggest you be careful, my friend. I intend to. With effort,
Sebastian brought his gaze back to the grinning fright on the slab.
What can you tell us about this one?
Well, judging by his teeth and certain other features, I'd say our friend here was about 40 years old when someone stuck that dagger in his back. He was an unusually large man, well over 6 feet tall, and probably 25 or more stone.
A very large man,
said Sebastian. From the condition of his internal organs, it's obvious he ate too much and drank too much. Not exactly unusual. Unfortunately, no. He still had most of his teeth, but at some point he must have broken his left forearm. It didn't heal well. See?
Sebastian studied the discernible kink in the man's left arm just below the elbow.
Anything of interest amongst his clothes? Nothing to give us the man's name. He had a fine gold pocket watch in his waistcoat, although unfortunately it wasn't engraved. His fob was in the shape of a rampant lion rather than a family crest. And his purse contained only a few banknotes dated from 1778 and 1781. I've sent the lot over to Bow Street.
From 1781? At least that narrows the date of death some.
Sebastian studied the cadaver's dark, leathery face.
Any wounds besides the knife in his back? Take a look for yourself.
Heaving the corpse onto its side, Gibson pointed to a slit just below the left shoulder blade.
This is where I found the blade, but he was also stabbed here. He indicated another tear toward the left. And here. 3 times, all in the bag. The first 2 wounds were not particularly deep.
Gibson eased the shriveled corpse onto its back again.
There may be more that I missed, given the condition of the body. No clue as to who might have killed him, or why. Sorry.
Sebastian cast a quick look around the small, dank room.
Where's the bishop?
Lying in state at London House.
Ah. When's the funeral?
Next week sometime.
Next week?
Gibson shrugged.
The church needs to allow time for everyone to assemble the proper mourning clothes.
At least the grave robbers won't have much interest in him by then.
An amused crease appeared in the Irish doctor's cheek.
Not in this weather.
Sebastian brought his attention back to the time-blackened corpse before them.
Anything that might connect the 2 murders? I'm afraid not.
Gibson rested his hips against the bench, his arms crossed at his chest.
It could simply be a coincidence, you know. The 2 bodies being found in the same place. The bishop hurries out to Tanfield Hill to investigate the discovery of the original murder victim, and either surprises someone in the act of robbing a crypt, or is followed by some enemy who decides to take advantage of the darkness and bash our good bishop over the head.
Sebastian rubbed one bent knuckle against the side of his nose.
I don't like coincidences.
Yet they happen.
They do.
Hunkering down, he studied the cadaver's distorted, sunken face with its gaping mouth and shriveled nostrils and empty eye sockets. After a moment, he said,
Think anyone who knew this man 30 years ago would recognize him if they saw him today?
In a word,
no. That's what I was thinking.
Sebastian pushed to his feet.
You say you sent his clothes over to Bow Street?
Yes.
Why?
It occurs to me that even if someone couldn't recognize our friend's face, they might remember his clothes, or at least his watch and fob. After all this time, if someone you loved disappeared into thin air, you don't think you'd remember what he was wearing, even after 30 or 40 years? Gibson thought about it a moment.
You might have a point.
Sebastian walked around the slab, studying the withered cadaver from every angle. But from any angle, none of it made any sense. Gibson said, It seems to me that when you come right down to it, there are basically 2 possibilities. Either our 18th century gentleman was killed by someone who had nothing to do with the bishop's death, Or they were both killed by the same man. Sebastian looked up. Why would a murderer wait 30 years or more to go after his second victim? I don't know. You're the expert on murderers. I just read their victims' bodies. There is one other alternative, said Sebastian slowly. Gibson frowned. What? That the bishop killed our 18th century gentleman, and then someone else killed the bishop in revenge. When the information from London House failed to arrive by 1 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, Hero set forth for St. James's Square in her carriage, accompanied by her long-suffering maid. "My dear Miss Jarvis," exclaimed the bishop's chaplain, all obsequious goodwill as he received her in his chambers, "I was just now preparing to send the details you requested around to Berkeley Square. I'm most dreadfully sorry for the delay, but the diary secretary only this instant completed making the necessary copies." "Thank you," she said, slipping the packet he handed her into her reticule. "You have heard, of course, that Archbishop Moore has requested the help of Viscount Devlin in investigating the bishop's death." He said the Viscount's name in the tone churchmen typically reserved for words like Jezebel and heathen and Satan. Devlin had obviously not ingratiated himself with the chaplain, or perhaps his reputation for hard living had simply preceded him. "I had heard," she said, with a great show of sympathy. "How distressing for you." He gave a soulful, It is. But it is what the Archbishop wants, so we must, of course, do what we can to facilitate the arrangement." "I suppose Devlin wanted to know all about the events of Tuesday night?" "Indeed he did. I told him everything from the Reverend Earnshaw's arrival to the bishop's own departure in his chaise." "Everything?" said Miss Jarvis with a smile. The chaplain gnawed thoughtfully on the inside of one cheek. Then he seemed to come to a decision. "Well," he said, leaning forward as he dropped his voice to a whisper, "I did leave out one or two little details about Monday." Hero listened to the chaplain's words with an outward show of calm interest, but inside she was anything but calm. When he had finished, she said, "I'm convinced you were quite right to keep these, details to yourself. I can see no need for Devlin to know of them." The chaplain sat back and heaved a relieved sigh, although he still looked vaguely troubled. "I'm so glad to hear you agree." Sebastian was eating a light luncheon in his own dining room when he heard a distant, timid tap-tap at the front door. A moment later, his dour-faced majordomo Maury appeared, to clear his throat apologetically and say, "A gentleman to see you, my lord. A clerical gentleman in a high state of nervous agitation. He says his name is Mr. Earnshaw, from St. Margaret's in Tanfield Hill." Sebastian pushed back his chair. "Show him into the drawing-room. I'll be with him in a moment." He found the Reverend of St. Margaret's hovering before the empty hearth. A small, softly fleshy man with slightly protruding eyes and a receding chin, he held his black hat gripped in both hands before him like a shield. "Mr. Earnshaw, an unexpected pleasure. May I offer you a glass of sherry, or do you prefer port?" A quiver of want passed over the man's features, but he said primly, "Nothing, thank you." Sebastian indicated the cane chairs near the room's front bow window. "Please, have a seat." The Reverend shook his head back and forth in short, sharp jerks. "No, thank you. I've come to apologize for not being in a fit state to receive you yesterday." "It's understandable," said Sebastian, pouring himself a glass of port. "You're certain you won't have something?" Again that quick, jerking shake of the head. "I'm told the Archbishop has requested your assistance in dealing with this
unpleasantness. I am therefore here to answer any questions you might have." The Archbishop had obviously expressed his displeasure at his underling's thoughtlessness in drugging himself into a 24-hour stupor. One did not displease the Archbishop of Canterbury, even if that archbishop was old and dying. "I think I've been able to piece together most of what happened that night," said Sebastian. "I gather that after the discovery of the body in the crypt, you travelled up to London to acquaint the bishop with the situation?" "That's right. Unfortunately, the bishop had an important appointment scheduled for 6 that evening. Rather than return with me immediately to St. Margaret's, he arranged to drive out to Tanfield Hill afterward. It was my intention to meet him at the church, but—" The Reverend's voice faded away. "But," prompted Sebastian. "One of my parishioners, Mrs. Cummings. She was ill. By the time I returned, the bishop had already arrived, and it was too late." The small protuberant eyes blinked rapidly several times in succession. "I just keep thinking that if only Bishop Prescott could have returned with me to St. Margaret's right away, none of this would have happened." Sebastian took a slow sip of his wine. "Did the bishop happen to mention the nature of the appointment he had that evening?" "No, only that he didn't feel he could cancel it. Something about an old friend in need of counselling." Sebastian's fist tightened around his glass. "Really?" "What had Miss Jarvis said?" "The bishop asked for my assistance in preparing the speech he was to give before the House of Lords this Thursday." The Reverend nodded again, his head moving up and down in a way that reminded Sebastian of a pigeon pecking at seed. Sebastian took another sip of his wine. "It seems a strange thing to have done, rushing off to the bishop simply because some workman had stumbled upon an old crypt. I mean, why the bishop?" "Because of the body, of course." "You were concerned about what, a scandal? Over a decades-old murder victim?" Mr. Earnshaw's eyes bulged alarmingly. "Good heavens! Can it be that you do not know?" "Don't know what?" "About the ring." "What ring?" "Sir Nigel's ring. I recognized it." Sebastian set aside his drink with a click. "You're saying you recognized a ring on the body in the crypt?" Yes, yes. An ancient Roman profile carved in black onyx and mounted in a setting of filigreed silver. Sir Nigel wore it always on his right little finger." "Who is Sir Nigel?" The Reverend stared at him. "Why, Sir Nigel Prescott, Bishop Prescott's eldest brother."